Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The Vanished in the Desert. I still remember the moment I first stepped into the desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, its heat shimmering in the distance like a mirage. It was supposed to be a routine trip, a scientific expedition to study the shifting dunes of Arizona's vast wilderness. But something about it felt off. We were a small team, just 5 of us, each one an expert in different fields of research. There was Dr. Sullivan, the geologist, always calculating, always thinking ahead. Miriam, the biologist, fascinated by desert life and the small, hidden creatures that survived in the harshest conditions. Then there was Alan, the photographer, who was determined to document every moment. And Sarah, the survival expert, who knew how to keep us alive in the most dangerous environments. And me. I'm Ethan, a researcher trained in remote sensing, specializing in satellite imaging and environmental analysis. I had joined this team because of my skills, but I never expected what we were about to face. The first sign that something was wrong came just 2 days into our expedition. At first, it was nothing more than a slight unease, a feeling that crept up on me like the wind before a storm. The desert, which had seemed vast and empty, suddenly felt too quiet. Even the wind had stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence. There was no rustling of leaves, no animals in sight, not even the distant cry of a hawk. Only an oppressive, heavy quiet. We made camp in the evening, setting up tents beneath the fading orange sky. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for a brief moment there was peace. But then it happened. I heard it, faint at first, a whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind. A rustling, like something moving through the sand. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. I thought it was nothing. The desert plays tricks on your mind, right? It was just the sound of the dunes shifting, the wind catching on the rocky outcrops. But Miriam, who had been sitting next to me, must have heard it too. She looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to admit that I had heard it too. The night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept replaying the sound in my mind. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else. Something deliberate. By the morning, the unease had grown into something more tangible. Dr. Sullivan was the first to notice it, an odd pattern in the sand. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, his voice trembling as he crouched down to examine the marks. The others gathered around him, and I joined them, trying to make sense of what he was pointing to. The sand wasn't disturbed in the way you'd expect from desert winds. No, these were deliberate lines, deep, angular cuts, like something had scraped its way through the dunes. The marks seemed to form an intricate pattern, like some kind of symbol. But there was no time to analyze it further. The heat was unbearable, and we had a schedule to stick to. Yet, as I looked at those lines, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were a warning. We moved on, leaving the strange marks behind, but the sense of dread only deepened. As the day stretched on, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the distance. A figure. A shape. anything that didn't belong. That evening, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold for a desert night. We huddled around the campfire, but the warmth didn't seem to reach me. My skin prickled, and every noise seemed amplified in the quiet darkness. The crackling of the fire, the snap of a twig, and then, once again, the whisper. I could feel my heart racing as I turned toward the sound, but this time there was something different. It wasn't just the wind. It was a footstep. A slow, deliberate step, crunching on the sand just outside our circle of light. "Is someone out there?" Alan asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was frozen, my mind racing. The footsteps weren't ours. There were only 5 of us in the camp, and none of us had moved. Yet, the sound was unmistakable. Another step. Closer. "Who's out there?" Sarah called out, grabbing her flashlight and shining it toward the sound. There was nothing. No movement, no shadow, nothing to explain what we had just heard. "Maybe it's just a wild animal," Dr. Sullivan said, though his voice lacked conviction. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a wild animal. Whatever it wasn't natural. And it was getting closer. The desert had become something else. It had stopped being a place of scientific exploration. It had become something far more dangerous. Something that wanted to keep us there forever. The next morning, I tried to dismiss everything that had happened the night before. I told myself it was just the desert playing tricks on us, that the heat was getting to my head, and the others had just been startled by a nocturnal animal. But deep down, I knew we were being watched. And it wasn't just the strange footsteps or the unexplainable whispers. There was something else, something more sinister, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The rest of the team didn't speak much about it. Sarah, ever the pragmatic one, suggested we move on. We had a schedule to follow, and if we didn't keep moving, we'd lose valuable daylight. It made sense, I suppose, but the desert wasn't the same anymore. It felt like it was alive, like it was watching us with a slow, deliberate hunger. The vanished in the desert. I still remember the moment I first stepped into the desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, its heat shimmering in the distance like a mirage. It was supposed to be a routine trip, a scientific expedition to study the shifting dunes of Arizona's vast wilderness. But something about it felt off. We were a small team, just 5 of us, each one an expert in different fields of research. There was Dr. Sullivan, the geologist, always calculating, always thinking ahead. Miriam, the biologist, fascinated by desert life and the small, hidden creatures that survived in the harshest conditions. Then there was Alan, the photographer, who was determined to document every moment. And Sarah, the survival expert, who knew how to keep us alive in the most dangerous environments. And me. I'm Ethan, a researcher trained in remote sensing, specializing in satellite imaging and environmental analysis. I had joined this team because of my skills, but I never expected what we were about to face. The first sign that something was wrong came just 2 days into our expedition. At first, it was nothing more than a slight unease, a feeling that crept up on me like the wind before a storm. The desert, which had seemed vast and empty, suddenly felt too quiet. Even the wind had stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence. There was no rustling of leaves, no animals in sight, not even the distant cry of a hawk. Only an oppressive, heavy quiet. We made camp in the evening, setting up tents beneath the fading orange sky. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for a brief moment there was peace. But then it happened. I heard it, faint at first, a whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind. A rustling, like something moving through the sand. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. I thought it was nothing. The desert plays tricks on your mind, right? It was just the sound of the dunes shifting, the wind catching on the rocky outcrops. But Miriam, who had been sitting next to me, must have heard it too. She looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to admit that I had heard it too. The night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept replaying the sound in my mind. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else. Something deliberate. By the morning, the unease had grown into something more tangible. Dr. Sullivan was the first to notice it, an odd pattern in the sand. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, his voice trembling as he crouched down to examine the marks. The others gathered around him, and I joined them, trying to make sense of what he was pointing to. The sand wasn't disturbed in the way you'd expect from desert winds. No, these were deliberate lines, deep, angular cuts, like something had scraped its way through the dunes. The marks seemed to form an intricate pattern, like some kind of symbol. But there was no time to analyze it further. The heat was unbearable, and we had a schedule to stick to. Yet, as I looked at those lines, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were a warning. We moved on, leaving the strange marks behind, but the sense of dread only deepened. As the day stretched on, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the distance. A figure. A shape. Anything that didn't belong. That evening, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold for a desert night. We huddled around the campfire, but the warmth didn't seem to reach me. My skin prickled, and every noise seemed amplified in the quiet darkness. The crackling of the fire. The snap of a twig. And then, once again, the whisper. I could feel my heart racing as I turned toward the sound, but this time there was something different. It wasn't just the wind. It was a footstep. A slow, deliberate step, crunching on the sand just outside our circle of light. "Is someone out there?" Alan asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was frozen, my mind racing. The footsteps weren't ours. There were only 5 of us in the camp, and none of us had moved. Yet, the sound was unmistakable. Another step. Closer. "Who's out there?" Sarah called out, grabbing her flashlight and shining it toward the sound. There was nothing. No movement, no shadow, nothing to explain what we had just heard. "Maybe it's just a wild animal," Dr. Sullivan said, though his voice lacked conviction. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a wild animal. Whatever it wasn't natural. And it was getting closer. The desert had become something else. It had stopped being a place of scientific exploration. It had become something far more dangerous. Something that wanted to keep us there forever. The next morning, I tried to dismiss everything that had happened the night before. I told myself it was just the desert playing tricks on us, that the heat was getting to my head, and the others had just been startled by a nocturnal animal. But deep down, I knew we were being watched. And it wasn't just the strange footsteps or the unexplainable whispers. There was something else, something more sinister, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The rest of the team didn't speak much about it. Sarah, ever the pragmatic one, suggested we move on. We had a schedule to follow, and if we didn't keep moving, we'd lose valuable daylight. It made sense, I suppose, but the desert wasn't the same anymore. It felt like it was alive, like it was watching us with a slow, deliberate hunger. As we packed up our camp and set off for the next location, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The desert stretched out before us, endless and empty, but it felt oppressive now. The air was thick, the silence overwhelming. I tried to focus on my equipment, the satellite data we were collecting, but it was hard to concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to those marks in the sand, those strange, angular cuts, and the footsteps that had no clear origin. By midday, the heat was unbearable, and we stopped for a short break. Miriam, usually so enthusiastic about her research, was unusually quiet, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she were searching for something. "I don't like this place," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of fear I hadn't heard before. I nodded in agreement. I didn't like it either, but I didn't know how to explain why. The desert had always been harsh, always unforgiving, but this felt different. It was like we were intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. And that something was starting to notice us. After the break, we continued on, but as the hours wore on, the situation only grew worse. The temperature plummeted once again as the sun began to set. And with the drop in temperature came the return of that chilling silence, the same suffocating quiet that had settled over us the night before. By the time we reached our next campsite, the sun had vanished completely, leaving the desert in pitch darkness. But the strange feeling didn't go away. It was like we were surrounded, even though there was nothing visible around us. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me, but the tension in the air was palpable. That night, the whispering returned. Only this time, it wasn't just a faint rustling. It was clearer now, definitive, deliberate footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking around our camp. "Did you hear that?" Miriam whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded. I wasn't sure what to say. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, that it was just the desert shifting. But it didn't feel like that. The footsteps were too distinct, too purposeful. And they were moving closer. "Who's out there?" Sarah called out, her voice filled with authority, but even she seemed unsure of herself. No response. Just the sound of footsteps crunching through the sand, coming nearer. Alan grabbed his camera, shining his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but once again, there was nothing. No one. "We're being paranoid," Dr. Sullivan said, his voice tight with nervous energy. "It's nothing. Just the desert playing tricks on us." But I could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't as confident as he tried to sound. Then, as if to prove my growing fear correct, the wind picked up suddenly, howling across the desert in violent gusts. The sand swirled around us in chaotic patterns, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, shuffling just beyond the reach of our campfire's glow. "I can't take this anymore," Miriam muttered, her voice breaking. "We need to leave. Now." I couldn't disagree. But where would we go? The desert was vast, and we were already far from the nearest settlement. I had a feeling that whatever was out there, it was following us, guiding us deeper into its domain. The more we tried to escape, the closer it would get. A sudden scream cut through the night, piercing the air and sending a wave of terror through all of us. It was Alan. We all froze, instinctively looking toward the source of the scream, but before any of us could move, Alan was standing in the middle of the camp, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. He had seen something none of us could explain. "What did you see?" Sarah asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Alan's gaze was locked on the darkness beyond the firelight, and when he spoke, his voice was cracked, filled with dread. I saw something. Something moving out there. It's not human." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their implication. None of us dared to move. We all stood frozen, staring into the abyss of the desert, unsure of what to do next. Whatever Alan had seen, we were now part of its game, and there was no turning back. The night stretched on, but it felt like an eternity. Alan's words echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. It's not human. The desert was silent once more, but the air felt thick, laden with an unseen presence, something sinister that was waiting for us to make a mistake. We huddled together near the campfire, trying to reassure each other, but none of us truly believed the words we spoke. Even Dr. Sullivan, the calmest of us all, couldn't hide the tension in his posture. We were all trying to figure out what had happened, but it didn't make sense. The footsteps, the whispers, Alan's panic, it didn't fit into any explanation we knew. It was as if the desert itself had come alive, conspiring against us. "I think we should leave," Miriam said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked around the camp nervously, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. "We need to go. Right now." I nodded, though the thought of moving through the desert at night, without knowing where to go, was terrifying. But the idea of staying in the camp, with whatever was out there stalking us, was worse. "We'll stick together," Sarah said, her voice firm. "No one goes off alone. We move fast, stay alert, and keep the fire between us and whatever's out there." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. We packed up the camp in a hurried panic, our hands trembling as we gathered our gear. The usual order and calm we had maintained earlier in the expedition had completely shattered. We were all acting on raw instinct now, guided by fear. As we made our way into the night, the world around us seemed to close in. The once immense desert felt claustrophobic. The stars overhead were hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, and the moon had no light to offer. The only illumination came from our flashlights, casting sharp, jagged shadows that seemed to twist and move in unnatural ways. And then, the whispering began again. Only this time, it wasn't just faint rustling. It was louder, more distinct. It was a voice, low and muffled, like it was coming from the ground itself. "Turn back," it said, barely audible over the wind. The voice was distorted, layered with echoes that made it impossible to pinpoint. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. "Turn back, now!" I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I wasn't the only one. Miriam's breath was shallow, her eyes darting around, trying to catch sight of whatever was speaking to us. Alan was at the front of the group, but I could see his hands shaking as he gripped the flashlight, his face pale with fear. "Who's there?" Sarah shouted, her voice sharp with command, though I could hear the tremor in it. "Show yourself." There was no answer, but the whispering continued, growing more insistent. "We can't outrun it," Dr. Sullivan muttered under his breath. His words were soft, but they carried the weight of something deep, something he had been trying to ignore. We should have never come here. We shouldn't have disturbed it. I glanced at him, but before I could speak, I felt something shift in the air. The temperature dropped again, much faster than before, and the air became thick, heavy with an unnatural chill. My breath came out in visible clouds, despite the fact that it was the desert. The footsteps, faint at first, began again. This time, there were more of them, thumping steadily through the sand. Slow. Relentless. "They're getting closer," Miriam whispered, her voice breaking. "What is it?" But before anyone could answer, there was a sharp scream from behind us. It was Alan. The sound was raw and desperate, filled with the kind of terror you couldn't fake. "Alan!" Sarah shouted, turning around to see him fall to the ground. I was frozen, rooted to the spot as Alan scrambled to his feet, his flashlight shining erratically as he looked around in a panic. His eyes were wide with fear, his mouth moving, but no words came out. His hand shot out, pointing to something behind us, but we couldn't see what he was seeing. Then, the air shifted again, and we heard it, the unmistakable sound of a low, guttural growl. I turned, instinctively raising my flashlight in the direction Alan had pointed, but the beam of light was swallowed by the darkness. There was nothing there. Nothing visible. But we felt it. A presence. Something massive. Something inhuman. "Run!" Sarah screamed. She didn't need to say it twice. The instinct to flee was overwhelming. We ran, stumbling, tripping over the uneven sand as we made our way through the desert. The growl behind us was growing louder, closer. The heavy footsteps echoed like thunder, each one more powerful than the last. We ran for what felt like hours, but there was no escape. The desert had turned into a labyrinth of shadows, and the distance between us and whatever was following us seemed to shrink with every passing second. And then, just as we thought we might make it out of the grasp of the desert's terror, it happened. There was a crack, sharp and final, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the sand. I turned around just in time to see Alan go down, his body crumpling like a rag doll, a shadowy figure looming over him. His scream was cut off abruptly, replaced by a sickening silence. We couldn't stop. We couldn't even look back. We couldn't afford to. But even as we kept running, I could feel the presence behind us. It was never far away. Always just out of sight, but always there. And that voice, soft and unyielding, like it had always been part of the desert, whispered one final command. "Leave or die." It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a promise. We kept running, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding in our chests. The desert, once an expansive and seemingly endless horizon, had now become a suffocating maze, closing in around us. The shadows behind us were no longer just shapes in the darkness. They were growing, morphing into something we couldn't escape. Something that was hungry for us. I could still hear the growl reverberating through the sand, a sound that came from deep within the earth itself. The footsteps weren't just behind us anymore, they were all around us, circling like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. And it wasn't just the sound that made the fear crawl beneath my skin. It was the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. "Where is it?" Miriam gasped, her voice high with panic. "Where is it?" "I don't know." Sarah screamed back, her voice breaking. "Keep moving. Just keep moving." The only thing that kept us running was the sheer terror that drove us forward, even as our legs began to falter, our bodies screaming for rest. We couldn't stop. We couldn't afford to. The whispers began again, louder now, sharper, more insistent. "Leave or die." It was the same voice, the one from before, but now it had grown in strength, becoming a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from every direction. The air itself felt thick, heavy with something ancient and malevolent, as if the desert had somehow come alive, wrapping its cold fingers around our hearts. Suddenly, a shriek cut through the night, sharp and blood-curdling. Miriam. I spun around, but I didn't see her. The others were still with me, but Miriam was gone. It happened so quickly. One moment she was beside me, and the next, she was swallowed by the darkness. No sound. No trace. Miriam. I screamed, my voice cracking. My heart leaped in my chest, and a cold dread swept over me. We stopped, our eyes frantically searching the black void around us. But there was nothing. No sign of her. Move. Sarah shouted, tugging at my arm. We can't stop. We can't waste time. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave her behind. But the pull of the desert, the unnatural force that was dragging us deeper into its heart, was stronger than any will to stay. We had to keep going. We moved, but it felt like we were going in circles, like the desert was warping around us. No matter which direction we ran, the footsteps continued to chase us, their rhythm unchanging. They never slowed. They never stopped. The world around us began to blur, the boundaries of the desert and the sky started to warp, twisting in strange ways, as though the landscape itself was distorting. The air grew colder, colder still, until it was impossible to ignore the bite of the frost on our skin. But it wasn't natural cold. It was the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, the kind that comes from a place beyond the physical world. Where are we? Alan's voice was small, cracking with terror. He had been quiet since we'd lost Miriam. I could see his face in the dim light of the flashlight, pale, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes wide with terror. But there was something else there now, something that wasn't fear. It was defeat. Just keep going, Sarah said, though I could see the strain in her voice. She was barely holding it together. We all were. Suddenly, the ground beneath us shifted. A low rumble began deep within the earth, growing louder until the very ground shook beneath our feet. The sand trembled, vibrating violently as if it was alive. Leave, the voice whispered again, but this time it was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar, shaking the very air. Leave or suffer. We didn't hesitate. We couldn't. I turned to see the others, Alan, Sarah, Dr. Sullivan, still following, but there was something in their eyes. Something I hadn't seen before. Their faces were drawn, exhausted, like they had already given up. They were already broken. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the rumbling stopped. The desert fell silent again, but the silence was worse than any noise. It was suffocating, as if the world was holding its breath. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and elongated, moving against the backdrop of the sand dunes. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something darker, something that didn't belong. It was close, too close. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet again, but this time it wasn't an earthquake. It was as if the very desert was reaching for us, pulling us toward whatever that shadow was. Run! Sarah screamed, and this time it wasn't just fear, it was desperation. She didn't need to say it again. We turned and fled, but the shadow was faster. It was everywhere, all around us. I could hear its breath, ragged and deep, like the wind itself had turned into something alive. And then, Without warning, it was there. A figure, tall and thin, its features distorted and twisted, an unnatural outline against the dark sky. The air around it hummed with a low, vibrating energy. It reached out, not with hands, but with the very desert itself. The sand seemed to stretch and move as if it were alive, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me down. I struggled, but it was useless. The grip of the desert was stronger than anything I could fight. I turned to look at the others. Sarah, Alan, Dr. Sullivan, they were all struggling, pulled into the depths of the sand, their screams muffled by the shifting ground. I was the last one left. The shadow moved toward me, its shape growing clearer, its form more solid as it approached. I could feel its presence pressing against my chest, suffocating me, drowning me in darkness. You should have never come. The voice, now clear and unmistakable, echoed in my mind, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a noose. And then, just as I thought I would be swallowed whole, I realized there was no escape. The desert had claimed us all. The end had come. There would be no rescue. No survivors. The sand closed around me like a tomb, its weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. My limbs were heavy, caught in the suffocating grip of the desert's relentless pull. The darkness was closing in, swallowing me whole, and the presence behind me, the shadow, the thing that had haunted us, loomed larger with each passing second. I struggled, but the more I fought, the deeper I sank. My feet were stuck, my body dragged downward as if the earth itself was feeding on my fear, pulling me into its depths. And then the voice came again, louder this time, a whisper that resonated in the very core of my being. You are mine now. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were felt. They were part of the air, part of the sand, part of the darkness that surrounded me. It was the desert speaking, or something ancient within it. Something that had been waiting for us. I looked up, but I couldn't see the stars anymore. The sky was a swirling vortex of black, a thick, oppressive cloud that blotted out any trace of light. The only light came from the eerie glow that emanated from the figure ahead of me. It was almost beautiful in its malevolent stillness, like a dark star in a forgotten sky. The figure was taller than anything human, its shape fluctuating, always shifting. Sometimes it had the vague outline of a person, thin, elongated limbs, a face that was smooth and featureless. Other times, it seemed like a mass of shadows, a writhing mass of darkness that couldn't be contained. But I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching, studying. I stopped struggling. I knew it was pointless. There was nowhere to run, no escape. You cannot escape what is inevitable, the voice echoed in my mind. It was calm, patient, as if it had waited millennia for this moment. You have disturbed the balance. And now, you will pay the price. The ground beneath me began to shift again, but this time, it wasn't just the sand. It was the very fabric of reality. Time seemed to stretch and warp as if the desert was rewriting the rules of the world. My sense of self began to dissolve, my thoughts slipping into a void that swallowed them whole. The fear, the confusion, it all began to feel distant, as if I were no longer the person I had once been. I was falling. Not physically, but in every other way. My mind, my body, my very essence were being consumed by the desert, swallowed by the thing that had been watching us all along. I could hear the screams of my companions in the distance, their voices fading, swallowed by the wind. But it didn't matter anymore. They were gone. I was alone. Alone in the heart of the desert. Alone with the presence that had claimed us all. And then, for a moment, everything went still. There was no sound, no wind, no whispers, no growls, just the oppressive weight of the silence pressing down on me like the desert itself was holding its breath. It was then that I saw the mark in the sand. At first, I thought it was just another illusion, a trick of the mind brought on by fear. But it was real, etched into the earth in perfect symmetry. An intricate symbol, circular and sharp, radiating out like the spokes of a wheel. It was as if the desert itself had drawn it there, as if it had been waiting for us to uncover it. I couldn't move, but my eyes were drawn to it, and I felt a strange sense of recognition. As if I had seen this symbol before. As if I had always known it would be here. "This is the price of curiosity," the voice said, softer now, almost gentle. "This is the price of those who dare to trespass." I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back, to run, to do anything, but the strength was gone. The desert had already taken what it needed. And then I felt it, a cold, unnatural wind, sharp against my skin. The symbol in the sand began to glow, faint at first, and then brighter, brighter until it seemed to burn the air itself. The desert was alive. Alive in ways we couldn't understand, and it had claimed us. The last thing I remember was the shadow moving closer, its form solidifying into something more real, more terrifying. And the whisper came again, echoing through my mind. "You are part of the desert now. Forever." The sand rose around me, swallowing everything. The figure, the whisper, the light. And then, there was nothing. No more fear. No more pain. No more desert. Only silence. Forever. The Dark Valley. It started with a question. A question that would later become my obsession. I had never been one for mysteries, or ancient relics, or things that were left buried beneath the earth for centuries. But something about the stones we found in the Valley of Utah intrigued me. It wasn't just the fact that they were there, no, it was how they seemed to beckon, calling to us in a way I couldn't explain. I'm Adam Reynolds, a field geologist. I've spent my life studying the land, its layers, its history written in rock. The deserts of Utah had always been a place of fascination for me, a vast, empty stretch of land that felt like a blank canvas, waiting for discovery. But what we found that day, those stones, wasn't something anyone could have predicted. We were a small team, just 3 of us, me, my colleague Jessica, and our guide, a local named Kyle. The sun was already low on the horizon when we stumbled upon the first stone. It was large, almost the size of a small car, sitting alone on a plateau just beyond a ravine. The light from the setting sun caught its surface, making it shine in a way that was almost unnatural. "That's odd," Kyle had said, crouching beside it. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen anything like it." Jessica was already pulling at her camera, snapping pictures. "It's definitely not a natural formation," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Look at these markings." The surface of the stone was covered in strange symbols, ancient, jagged lines that crisscrossed each other in chaotic patterns. They weren't anything I recognized from my studies of indigenous petroglyphs or natural geological formations. It was almost as if they had been carved by a hand that didn't belong to any known civilization. I felt a chill run through me, though I couldn't explain why. It was a simple stone, after all. It was nothing but rock. At least, that's what I told myself. But the more we examined it, the more the feeling lingered, like a shadow creeping over us. Something about the place felt wrong. The wind had stopped, and the usual desert sounds had faded into a thick, oppressive silence. Even the birds, which had been chirping moments before, seemed to have gone quiet. Maybe it's just a freak of nature, I said, trying to brush off the unease that had begun to settle deep in my gut. Kyle nodded, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. Maybe. But I've heard stories, stories about things buried out here, things older than anything we can understand. Jessica raised an eyebrow. What stories? Kyle shrugged, but there was an air of unease around him now, too. Stories from the old-timers. About rocks that don't belong, strange shapes in the land that move on their own. And some say that those who touch them don't come back the same. I scoffed, brushing off his words as superstition. But the stone was still there, standing silent in the fading sunlight, and for the first time in my career, I wondered if there might be some truth to Kyle's words. After a moment of silence, I took a step forward and ran my fingers over the surface of the stone. The moment my skin made contact, a strange sensation jolted through me. It wasn't painful, but it was unsettling, like the stone itself was alive, pulsing with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Adam? Jessica's voice broke through the tension. She was staring at me, her eyes wide. What's happening? You look pale. I tried to pull my hand away, but it wouldn't move. The stone seemed to hold onto me, its surface warm and rough beneath my fingers. I felt something stir beneath the earth, as if the land itself was shifting, waking up. The air around us thickened, and the silence deepened, wrapping us in a cocoon of unnatural quiet. Adam, what are you doing? Jessica's voice was more urgent now, panic creeping into her tone. I yanked my hand away, stumbling backward. The stone surface felt colder now, almost as if it had drained something from me. Nothing, I muttered, my voice hoarse. I don't know what happened. Kyle was already moving toward the stone, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. We should go. Now. We didn't question him. We packed up quickly, leaving the stone behind, though I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting. As we made our way back toward the jeep, I heard a sound, a whisper. A voice, faint but distinct, carried on the wind. Leave, while you can. I froze. The others didn't seem to hear it. They were talking, laughing, relieved to be leaving the strange stone behind. But I heard it. Clear as day. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Hear what? Jessica asked, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words died in my throat. It didn't matter. I had already made a decision. There was something about the valley, about the stones, something we hadn't yet understood. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just begun to uncover something far darker than we ever expected. I couldn't explain it, but the whisper lingered in my mind, curling around my thoughts like smoke. And I knew, deep down, that I would return to find the answers, even if it meant I never came back. It's hard to explain what draws someone back to a place like that, to a valley that feels wrong, that whispers your name on the wind like an omen. But here I am, a week later, standing at the edge of the desert again, my mind still wrapped around those stones and that feeling that I couldn't shake. I should have let it go. I should have left it alone. But something inside me, something deep in my gut, told me I couldn't. The stones were calling me back. And maybe it was the thrill of discovery, or maybe it was the terror that still simmered under my skin, but I had to return. Kyle and Jessica, understandably, had refused to come back with me. Kyle was wary from the start, but after hearing the stories he kept to himself, he had insisted that the stones were something we weren't meant to understand. Jessica, more rational than Kyle, thought I had gone mad, chasing after superstitions. But the whispers wouldn't leave my mind. I made the drive alone, the barren land stretching out before me like an empty sea. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air shimmered with heat, but nothing seemed quite real. It was as if the very earth beneath me was holding its breath. The world felt still, as though it were waiting for something to happen. When I finally reached the plateau again, it was just as I remembered. The stone was still there, sitting in the middle of the landscape, as though it had never moved. It was larger than I remembered, or maybe it just appeared that way now. The shadows around it seemed to stretch longer than they should have, as if the light itself was bending. I walked slowly toward it, my heart racing. With every step, the air grew thicker, colder. The sounds of the desert, the wind, the distant call of a hawk had vanished. There was only silence, and it was suffocating. I reached the stone and hesitated. The marks were still there, etched deeply into the surface, swirling in patterns that didn't make sense. It was as though they were alive, constantly shifting just out of reach of my understanding. I could feel something in my chest tighten, a pressure that grew stronger the closer I got to it. I reached out to touch it again, and this time, the stone didn't feel warm. It was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been sitting in the dark for centuries. My fingers brushed over the surface, and I felt the same jolt of energy, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a sensation, it was an invasion. The stone seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips, sending a shiver through my whole body. My breath caught, and I tried to pull away, but it was as if the stone had taken hold of me. My vision blurred, and a low hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated in my skull. And then the whispers came again, louder this time, more insistent. You should not have come back. I pulled my hand away with a gasp, stumbling backward. The stone was glowing now, faintly at first, then brighter until it almost burned. I turned and ran, my feet stumbling over the uneven terrain. My heart pounded in my chest, but the whispers were everywhere now, louder, more frantic. You cannot escape. The ground beneath me shifted, as though it were moving, twisting, turning. The very earth seemed alive, as if it was reaching for me, pulling me down into the sand. I looked back, but the stone was gone. The plateau, the desert, everything was gone. There was only darkness, thick and suffocating, swirling around me. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I had to get out before it consumed me, before it swallowed me whole. I ran, my legs aching, the air growing heavier with each step. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and I couldn't see. I stumbled, falling, scraping my hands on the rough ground, but I couldn't stop. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. The desert was back, the plateau was back, the stones were gone. Everything was as it had been before. I was standing alone in the middle of the desert, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. The sun was setting again, but it felt wrong. It felt like I was out of time, like I had slipped through a crack in the world. And then I saw them, more stones, scattered across the desert, just beyond the plateau. Dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle, their surfaces covered with the same symbols. Some were small, some were large, and some were broken, shattered as if they had been thrown aside. I didn't need to touch them to know what they were. They were the same as the one I had found before, the same as the one I had been drawn to. And I knew, deep down, that they weren't just relics. They were traps. They were pieces of something ancient, something far beyond our understanding, and they were calling us, beckoning us to come closer, to get lost in the mystery, to fall into their grasp. I knew then that I wasn't alone in this valley. The whispers were everywhere now, circling around me like a swarm. And I realized with a sickening certainty that I had walked into something I couldn't escape. I turned, running again, but the landscape was no longer familiar. It shifted with every step I took. I couldn't find my way out. The valley was alive, and it had claimed me. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the land, I heard the voice once more, clear in my mind. You are part of it now. Forever. I looked behind me, but the stones had already disappeared, swallowed by the dark. The valley was silent once again, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the valley came for the rest of them. I don't remember how long I wandered in the desert after the stones disappeared. It could have been hours, or it could have been days. Time had lost all meaning. The sun hung in the sky, perpetually setting, casting everything in a sickly orange light. I was no longer sure where the plateau was. The land had twisted itself into something unrecognizable, a labyrinth of sand and jagged rocks. There was no sign of the jeep, no sound of the distant highway that had been my escape route. It was as though the valley had swallowed it all. My mind raced with thoughts, desperate to find a rational explanation for what had happened. Had I fallen unconscious? Was it some sort of heat stroke, a mirage that my body had conjured from the extreme desert conditions? I wanted to believe that, but deep inside, I knew it wasn't true. The land felt different now. Alive. Watching me. The whispers were still there, crawling beneath my skin, and I could hear them even when I tried to block them out. You shouldn't have come. You can never leave. I tried to focus, to push past the terror, but every direction I took led me deeper into the unknown. The more I walked, the more the desert seemed to change. It wasn't just the terrain, it was the very air. There was a heaviness in it now, a weight that pressed against my chest. And the silence, it wasn't natural. Even in the depths of the desert, there should have been the sounds of distant wildlife, the faint hum of the wind, the rustle of sand. But now, there was only an overwhelming, suffocating quiet, broken only by the whispers that slithered through the air like a bad dream. I stumbled forward, the hot sand burning my feet through my boots. I had no idea where I was going, only that I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. And then I saw it. The stone. The first one. It was in the distance, just barely visible through the swirling dust, standing alone in the center of the valley. It was glowing again, faintly at first, but growing brighter as I approached. I froze. The whispers had stopped, but I could feel something else. A presence. It wasn't just the stone that had drawn me here. It was something else. Something ancient and powerful, lurking beneath the surface of the earth. I felt the pull again. This time, it was not the curiosity of discovery. It was an irresistible force, something pulling me in, as though the stone knew I had already crossed the line. I had touched it once before, and now it was calling me again. Without thinking, I began walking toward it, my steps slow and deliberate. Each step felt like a struggle, as if the earth itself was trying to keep me from getting closer. But I couldn't stop. I was too far gone. When I reached the stone, I could feel the air around me vibrate like the sound of distant thunder. It was almost as if the land itself was holding its breath. The markings on the stone seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting, changing, like the symbols were trying to tell me something. Something I couldn't quite understand. I reached out to touch it again. The moment my fingers brushed against its surface, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground, the cool desert sand beneath me. The stone was gone. The valley was still. And I was alone again. I stood up slowly, my body aching as if I had been dragged across the land. I felt the weight of the valley pressing down on me, but I didn't understand why. I didn't know what had just happened, but I could feel something was different. Something had shifted. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. You cannot escape. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, silent and empty. Yet I could feel the voice lingering in the air, like a presence just out of sight. You are part of it now, the voice whispered, its tone almost soothing, as if it were trying to comfort me. I shook my head, trying to force the voice out of my mind, but it only grew louder. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was an echo, reverberating through the very fabric of the land. You have crossed the threshold. There is no going back. I clutched my head, desperate to block out the words, but the voice kept repeating over and over until it became a chant. You are part of it now. You will never leave. The ground beneath me shifted again, this time violently. The stones returned, scattered across the desert, their markings glowing like fire. I could see them now, clearly, in the distance. The valley had come alive, and I was at the center of it all. I knew then that the stones weren't just relics. They were guardians, anchors that held something ancient and powerful beneath the earth. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. And I had woken it. The valley was no longer just a place. It was a prison. A prison that I couldn't escape. I ran. I didn't care where. I just had to get away. I didn't even know if I could find my way back to the road, to civilization, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the voice, the whispers, the feeling that something was chasing me, closing in from all sides. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, the valley never ended. The stones were always there, waiting, watching. And in the distance, I could see them. The stones were moving. Slowly, impossibly, they were shifting, crawling across the desert toward me. I had become part of the valley. And it was taking me in, piece by piece. The ground trembled beneath my feet as I ran, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stop. Every breath felt like it was my last, every step was heavier than the last, but I couldn't, no, I wouldn't give up. Now I could feel the stones shifting, moving behind me, creeping closer. The whispers had become a cacophony, 1,000 voices all at once, each one dragging me deeper into madness. You belong to us now. You are ours. The words echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my skull. I could hear the stones now, scraping across the sand like 1,000 claws, slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the moment, taking their time. They weren't chasing me, they were watching me, calculating, waiting for me to falter. I glanced over my shoulder, and the stones were closer now, too close. They weren't just scattered across the desert, they were arranged, forming a path, an unbroken line leading straight into the heart of the valley. The markings on them glowed brighter than before, their shapes becoming more distinct, more recognizable. I could see now that they weren't just symbols, they were figures, twisted shapes, like faces frozen in torment, frozen in time. I stumbled over a loose rock and fell to the ground, my hand scraping against the sand. Panic surged through me. I had to get up. I had to keep moving. But I could feel something pulling at me, something in the very air, as if the valley itself was trying to drag me down. I got to my feet, trembling. The desert had never felt this oppressive before. The heat that had once been stifling was gone, replaced by an unnatural chill. I could see my breath, misting in the cold air, but there was no wind. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the valley, if it could even be called a hum. It was more like a vibration in the ground, in my bones, that rattled me to my core. I couldn't escape. I couldn't run. The valley had already taken me. There was no way out. I kept moving, though. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was sheer desperation. I didn't know. My legs were numb, but I pushed on, stumbling across the cracked desert floor. The stone circle was still there, always in my peripheral vision, no matter how far I went. It seemed to be drawing me in, pulling me toward it, a magnetic force I couldn't resist. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, I saw something, a figure in the distance. A shadow, standing perfectly still, just beyond the circle of stones. I squinted, and my pulse quickened. It was a person. A silhouette, barely visible against the harsh desert landscape. My breath caught in my throat. Could it be Kyle or Jessica? Had they found me? Were they trying to help? I ran toward the figure, my feet heavy with exhaustion, but my mind fixed on the hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its shape twisted and unnatural. The air around it shimmered, like a mirage, distorting the figure as I approached. I called out, but my voice came out strangled, as if the valley itself had swallowed my words. I reached out, but the closer I got, the more the figure seemed to fade, to melt into the air, until it was nothing more than a dark spot in the distance. And then, in the silence, the stone circle began to hum again, louder this time. It was no longer a vibration in the ground, it was a sound that filled the air, the desert itself vibrating with it, resonating deep inside me. The stones, those cursed stones, seemed to pulse, like they were alive. The faces on them were no longer just shapes, they were contorted in agony, their mouths opening as though they were screaming, but no sound came. I was losing my mind. The desert had swallowed it whole. And then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder, icy and unyielding. I froze. It was impossible. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Yet the sensation lingered, creeping up my spine, the weight of it pressing down on me like an invisible force. It was real. I could feel it. I wasn't alone. You've crossed the threshold, the voice whispered, not from the stones, but from all around me, as if it were coming from the earth itself. You can never leave. I opened my mouth to scream, but the words were choked off, swallowed by the endless silence. The valley was alive, and it had already claimed me. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring, the ground spinning beneath me. The world was collapsing in on itself, and I couldn't hold on any longer. And then, everything went black. I woke up, if you can even call it waking, still in the valley, but everything was different. The stones were no longer scattered across the landscape. They were everywhere, all around me. They were taller now, like towering monoliths, their faces now more distinct. They were no longer just symbols or images, they were people, twisted and deformed, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. I was trapped in their gaze, in their screams. And then, I saw it. The figure again. But this time, I wasn't sure it was human. It stood at the center of the stone circle, its shape shifting, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its mouth opened, but instead of sound, a flood of images rushed into my mind. Memories that weren't mine. A civilization long forgotten. A people who had lived and died in this place. A curse that had been placed upon the land. And I understood, in that moment, that I wasn't meant to be here. I was never meant to find the stones. I was never meant to escape. The valley was ancient. It had waited for me, for my curiosity, for my weakness. It had claimed me. And now, it would never let me go. I tried to scream, but the only sound that came from my mouth was the whisper of the stones, growing louder and louder until it drowned everything else out. You were part of it now. And that was the last thing I heard. I don't know how much time passed after the last words echoed in my mind. The world around me had become a blur, shifting, twisting, folding in on itself. The valley wasn't a place anymore. It was a cage, a living entity that pulsed with a rhythm I could feel in my very bones. The stones were everywhere, and they watched me with eyes I couldn't escape. Their faces were no longer just twisted, they were angry now, screaming in silence. I could feel their rage, their hunger, as if they were feeding off of my fear. Every step I took only brought me closer to the heart of the valley, where the figure stood, waiting. I couldn't tell if the figure was real or just a hallucination brought on by the madness of the desert, but it didn't matter. I had seen it too many times now to ignore it. The figure was the key. It was the one who had been waiting for me, the one who had lured me here, whose presence was both a threat and a promise. It was the keeper of the valley, the one who ensured no one left. I felt the pull again, stronger this time. The whisper of the stones was louder, and I knew I had no choice. I was being dragged toward it, toward the figure. The air had thickened, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step, as if the valley itself was breathing. When I reached the center, the figure was waiting for me, standing still in the center of the circle of stones. Its form was no longer just a shadow, no longer just a distorted shape, it was something else entirely. It was ancient, monstrous, a being that was neither alive nor dead, a being that existed in the space between. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and its mouth was open as if it were about to speak. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. The valley had wrapped itself around me, and there was no escape. The figure raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and the stones around us began to vibrate. Their faces twisted in agony, their mouths opening wide, but still no sound escaped. The ground beneath me trembled, and I could feel the weight of the valley pressing down, suffocating me. I wanted to run, to flee, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far beyond my understanding. The figure's eyes never left mine. It reached out, its long fingers brushing against my face, and I felt a shock of cold rush through me, freezing me to the core. The air around me shifted, and I could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the earth for eons. And then, it spoke. You shouldn't have come. The The words were like a dagger to my soul, cold and final. The valley wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a prison for those who dared to seek the stones, for those who tried to unlock the secrets buried here. It had taken me, just as it had taken so many before me, and there would be no escape. I finally felt the terror that had been building in my chest reach its peak. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. The whispers had stopped. The valley was still. But I knew I wasn't alone. The figure loomed over me, its eyes burning with an intensity that made me want to scream, to beg for mercy. But there was no mercy here. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, its form warping and shifting in ways that defied nature. "You are part of it now," it said, its voice echoing through the valley, through my very being. "You are part of the land. The stones will never let you go." I wanted to run. I wanted to fight, but my body refused to move. I was trapped, locked in the grip of the valley, and I could feel it, slowly, gradually, consuming me. The world around me twisted, the stones growing taller, the faces more defined, their eyes staring at me with an unbearable hunger. I was nothing more than a fragment of a story now. A part of the valley, a part of the curse. The valley had claimed me, just as it had claimed everyone before me. The figure raised its hand again, and the stones began to glow. The air thickened, and the vibration grew louder, reverberating through every bone in my body. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my mind with images of the past, of those who had walked this land and disappeared, of the ancient ones who had created the stones to trap the curious, the explorers, the fools who thought they could uncover the secrets of the valley. And then, everything went silent. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the figure, its eyes locking with mine, as it whispered one final, chilling sentence. "You will never leave. This is your eternity." And then, I was swallowed whole. The valley remained quiet. The stones stood tall, their faces forever frozen in silent screams. The wind picked up, swirling the sand around them, but there was no one to witness it. The figure was gone, and so was I. The valley had claimed another soul. And it would claim more. Because the valley would never forget. It would never release its hold. And it would always be waiting. The tracks in the snow. The mountain air was sharp, biting at my skin, and the snow crunched beneath my boots with each step. The peaks of the Colorado Rockies towered above us, their jagged edges piercing the sky like ancient teeth. The silence here was overwhelming, almost suffocating, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. I hadn't been on a climb this remote in years, and now I remembered why. The isolation was heavy, almost oppressive, but that was part of the appeal. There were only 5 of us, myself, Kate, Liam, Adam, and Rachel, each of us seasoned climbers who had made a career of navigating some of the world's most challenging peaks. But this was different. There was something about this mountain, something unspoken among us, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. It started as a whisper, a thought that flickered across my mind like a fleeting shadow, but as we ascended higher into the snow-covered slopes, the feeling grew stronger. Like we were intruding. "Do you hear that?" Liam's voice broke through the silence. His breath formed a cloud in the cold air, and his eyes darted nervously to the side. I paused, listening intently. There was a faint crunching sound in the snow, distant but distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. I could feel it now, the tension hanging in the air, as if we were being watched. But there was nothing, no sign of movement in the white expanse around us. "It's probably just the snow settling," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "Let's keep moving." But I knew something wasn't right. We pressed on, making our way up the ridge, the tracks we left behind already half covered by the wind. The further we went, the more it seemed as if the mountain was closing in around us. The world felt smaller, the silence more suffocating. I could feel the weight of it on my shoulders, a pressure that threatened to crush me. And then, as we neared the top of the ridge, I saw it. At first, it was just a faint disturbance in the snow, a series of irregular tracks, deep and wide, leading off the path and into the wilderness. They didn't belong. The tracks were too large, too spread out. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And they led directly toward a dark, jagged rock formation in the distance. A cave, I realized, its mouth gaping like a hungry maw in the snow. "Guys, look at this," I called out, my voice suddenly tight. The others gathered around, their faces etched with confusion and unease. Kate bent down to examine the tracks, her fingers brushing the snow. "They're too big for a bear," she murmured. "And there's no other animal around here that could make tracks like this." We all stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us. The cave seemed to draw us in, as if it was waiting for us. The tracks led straight to it, as though someone, or something, had deliberately created a path. "Do we go in?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking slightly. "We don't know what's in there," Liam warned. "This could be dangerous." I looked at the cave again, a dark, hollow space that seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. My gut told me we should turn back, that we were being pulled into something far worse than we could imagine, but curiosity gnawed at me, sharp and insistent. "We're already this far," I said, my voice steady. "Let's just take a look. We're climbers. We've faced worse." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just another climb. This wasn't a challenge to conquer. This was something else entirely. Something ancient. I gave the others a nod, and we moved toward the cave. The tracks were fresh, too fresh, and as we stepped closer, the air grew colder. The hairs on my neck prickled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt fear seep into my bones. We didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning. The beginning of something none of us would be prepared for. The cave stood before us, its entrance dark and inviting. We stepped inside, our boots echoing against the stone walls, but the further we went, the more the air felt alive with something otherworldly. The walls seemed to close on us, and the cold was unbearable, seeping through our clothes and into our very souls. There was no turning back now. The darkness swallowed us whole as we stepped into the cave. Our headlamps flickered to life, casting harsh beams of light that barely made a dent in the oppressive blackness around us. The cold was unbearable, much worse than the biting mountain wind outside. It seeped into our skin, through our clothes, as if the cave itself was alive and pulsing with an ancient, unknowable chill. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the narrow passageway, the faintest sound magnified in the tight space. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and the soft rustling of jackets as the others adjusted their packs. Yet, there was a new sound now, a faint scratching, almost like claws scraping against stone. I froze. "What was that?" Kate whispered, her voice tense. Liam, who was leading, stopped and turned back to us. "Probably just some rodents," he said, though his voice betrayed his own unease. But I knew better. That sound, it didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Almost like footsteps. We continued, but the air seemed to grow heavier with each step, thick with something unexplainable. My mind raced with thoughts of old legends, stories told around campfires about cursed places in the world, places where time bent and reality twisted. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, but I pushed the thought aside. There was no place for superstition here. We were climbers, adventurers, not the sort to be intimidated by shadows. The tunnel opened up ahead, widening into a large cavern. We stepped into the space, our lights casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then we saw them. Scattered across the ground, half buried in the snow and dirt, were more tracks. Similar to the ones outside, but these were different, older, more weathered, as though they had been here for a long time. Some of the prints were indistinct, their edges blurred, as if the snow had tried to erase them. But they were unmistakable. What in the hell? Adam muttered under his breath. These are like the tracks we saw outside, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But they're older. What the hell is going on here? I could feel the others closing in around me, their unease palpable. But then Rachel, who had been silent until now, gasped. Look, she pointed, her hand trembling. At first, I couldn't see what she was talking about. But then, as the beam of my headlamp moved across the cavern floor, I noticed something, a set of footprints that led to the far wall. They were perfectly spaced, as if someone had walked slowly and deliberately toward the stone. I squinted, taking a step closer. The tracks led directly to the wall, where a jagged fissure cut through the rock. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but the snow and ice around the crack were disturbed, as if something, or someone, had recently passed through. We need to get out of here, Kate said urgently, her voice shaking. This is too much. Something's wrong. But I couldn't pull myself away. I had to know. There was a pull, something deep inside that urged me forward. I took a step toward the crack in the wall, my breath catching in my throat. Wait, I said, glancing back at the others. We're already this far. We need to see what's on the other side. Rachel hesitated, looking like she might argue, but then she nodded reluctantly. The others followed suit, and together, we crouched down and began to squeeze through the narrow gap in the rock. On the other side, the space opened up into a massive chamber. The floor was slick with ice, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize, etched into the stone in what appeared to be some kind of ancient script. The air in this chamber was thick, heavy with a musty scent that made my stomach churn. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, raised upon a stone platform, was a figure, an idol, if you could call it that. It was carved from dark stone, worn smooth by centuries of neglect. The figure was humanoid, but distorted, its face twisted into an expression of pain or terror, its limbs long and unnaturally elongated. I took a step closer, my heart racing. There was something wrong about it. A sickening aura that made my skin crawl. Do you feel that? Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This place, it's like it's alive. I nodded, feeling the same sensation, a kind of heaviness that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The idol seemed to draw me in, as if it was calling to me, and I couldn't look away. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. A deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the cave. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and the walls seemed to close in around us. Get out! Now! I shouted, panic surging through me. But it was too late. The entrance, the way we had come in, was gone. The tunnel had collapsed, sealing us in. We were trapped. And then, in the distance, I heard it again, the scratching sound, louder this time. It was closer, and I knew, whatever was out there, it was coming for us. The darkness pressed in around us, and I realized with a sickening clarity that we were no longer alone. Panic surged through me as the walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with each passing second. The rumbling subsided, but the silence that followed was deafening. We stood frozen, our breath visible in the frigid air, as if the cave itself was alive, watching, waiting. What the hell just happened? Adam's voice cracked, his fear palpable. Move! I shouted. My mind raced, trying to come up with some rational explanation. The collapse must have been caused by a natural shift in the mountain structure. Or rock slide, maybe. But the tracks, those footprints, were something else entirely. They weren't just marks in the snow. They were deliberate, leading us straight to this place. But I couldn't focus on that now. The first priority was survival. I turned back to the collapsed tunnel, hoping there was some way to dig our way out, but the rocks were piled high. There was no way through. Help me look around, I said, my voice low, but urgent. Liam and Kate moved toward the back of the chamber, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The rest of us stood still for a moment, listening. That scratching sound, it was still there. Only now, it was closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my pulse quickened. Rachel looked around, her face pale. What is that? Where is it coming from? I didn't have an answer. Every instinct told me that we weren't alone, but I couldn't see anything. The flickering beam of my headlamp barely illuminated the edges of the cavern, leaving most of the space shrouded in thick shadows. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, methodical, dragging against the stone floor. I whipped my head around, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I took a step forward, then another, the others following reluctantly. My boots crunched on the snow-covered ground, each step louder than the last, until I was standing directly in front of the idol. It was so wrong. The idol was wrong. Its grotesque features seemed to shift under the harsh light of our headlamps, as if the shadows were playing tricks on me, distorting its shape. A shiver ran down my spine. What is this place? Liam asked, his voice almost a whisper, but it carried an edge of disbelief. It doesn't matter, I said, trying to sound calm, though my throat felt tight. We need to get out of here. Now. But even as I spoke the words, I knew it was too late. Something in the air had changed. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of dread, a weight that hung over us like an impending storm. And then the scratching sound came again, louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. There was something moving in the dark. Something that wasn't just the wind or an animal. I grabbed Rachel's arm. We need to move now. We ran toward the far side of the cavern, our lights dancing frantically over the uneven ground. But then, nothing. No more scratching. No more footsteps. The silence pressed in again, heavy and suffocating. I looked back. The idol stood motionless in the center of the room, but now it seemed to be watching us, its hollow eyes reflecting the light of our lamps. My stomach turned. Where's Kate? Liam asked suddenly. I spun around. Kate had been with us just a moment ago, but now she was nowhere to be seen. Her absence struck me with cold panic. The others must have realized it too, because we all started calling her name, our voices bouncing off the walls. "Kate!" I shouted. "Kate, answer me!" No response. "Damn it," Adam muttered under his breath. She was right behind us. We retraced our steps, the light of our headlamps barely cutting through the darkness. The cave had changed. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping on us from all directions. The walls felt alive, as though they were breathing. Then, as I turned the corner, I saw her. Kate was standing at the far end of the chamber, facing the wall. Her back was to us, but I could see her hands pressed against the stone as if she were listening for something. "Katie!" I called out. She didn't respond. In fact, she didn't even move. Something was very wrong. I took a step forward, then another, my heart racing. "Kate!" But as I approached, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. There were marks on the wall. Long, jagged scratches, deeper than any natural erosion should have caused. And in the center of them, handprints. Small, delicate handprints smeared in a thick substance that looked like blood. I reached out to Kate, my voice trembling. "Kate, what's going on?" Her head snapped around, and I froze. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, but they were empty. Blank, as if she wasn't truly there. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, only a soft, guttural rasp. And then she whispered, barely audible, "They're coming." Before I could react, she lunged at me, grabbing my shoulders with an unnatural force. Her grip was like iron, cold and clammy, and I struggled to break free. "Kate!" I yelled, shaking her. "What's wrong with you?" But her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw it. The thing that had been moving in the dark. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else, something inhuman. The light from my headlamp flickered, and then the world went black. And I realized with a sickening certainty that we weren't just trapped in a cave. We were in the presence of something much older, much darker than anything we had ever imagined. It was hunting us. I woke up gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness was overwhelming. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but all I saw were the flickers of my headlamp, barely cutting through the thick blackness. Where was I? What happened? The cold was biting, but it wasn't the usual mountain chill. It felt unnatural. I pushed myself up, disoriented, my body aching from where I had been thrown against the stone floor. The air tasted stale, like it had been trapped here for centuries. I looked around. The others were scattered in the chamber, motionless, their bodies crumpled like ragdolls. Panic surged through me as I rushed toward them, shaking their shoulders, calling their names. "Rachel!" I whispered urgently. "Adam!" "Liam!" But they didn't respond. I checked their pulses. Weak. Faint. Barely there. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I realized that none of them were dead, at least not yet. But something had taken them to the brink. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cave, sending a shock of fear straight to my bones. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears. I couldn't make out the source, but I felt it. Something was moving. Something was watching. I stood up, my legs shaky, and turned toward the shadows, my hand clutching the ice pick like a weapon. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. How had we ended up here? The last thing I remembered was Kate, her blank, empty eyes, and then darkness. The scratching sound from before began again, distant but unmistakable. Slowly, methodically. Closer now. But it wasn't just the sound of claws on stone. No, it was the sound of something that didn't belong. A rhythm that sent shivers crawling down my spine. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I needed to leave before whatever hunted us found me. Kate, I whispered, looking toward the far end of the cavern. There was no sign of her. The place felt like it was swallowing us whole, and I couldn't tell if she had left or if something else had taken her. The walls were narrow now, the stone pressing in on me from all sides. I felt claustrophobic, like I was trapped in a tomb. I staggered toward the entrance of the chamber, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air seemed to grow colder the closer I got, my footsteps echoing in the silence, until I stopped. A faint whisper. No, more like a breath. Soft. Low. Almost human. I spun around, heart racing. But the chamber was empty. There was nothing there. No sign of the others, no sign of Kate. Only the dark, stretching farther than I could see. I reached for my pack and pulled out the flare gun. There had to be a way out. There had to be. If I could signal for help, if someone outside the cave could hear it. But the flare gun was gone. No. It wasn't just gone. It was destroyed. The barrel was bent, the trigger broken off, as if something had crushed it in a single motion. I staggered back. No. This wasn't right. Nothing made sense. I needed to keep moving, to find an exit. I couldn't stay here any longer. Another growl. Closer this time. Louder. The walls trembled under the force of it, the ground vibrating beneath my feet. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The tracks in the snow. They had led us here for a reason. They had brought us to this cursed place. I turned and began to run, blindly, through the winding tunnels of the cave. The walls were slick with ice, the floor uneven, but I didn't care. Every step was a struggle, every breath a battle. Behind me, the sound of scratching, of dragging feet, grew louder. Closer. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't outrun them. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell, tumbling into a narrow shaft. I hit the walls, bruising my arms and shoulders, but I couldn't stop myself from falling. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, spiraling deeper into the earth. The fall seemed endless. When I finally hit the bottom, I could barely catch my breath. My head was spinning, the world spinning with it. But I knew, deep down, that I had to keep moving. No matter how badly my body screamed for rest, no matter how exhausted I was, I couldn't stop. I had to survive. The growl came again, this time so close that I could feel the vibrations in the air. Something was coming for me, something dark and ancient. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. And in the distance, I saw it. A faint light. Just a flicker, a glimpse of hope, like the smallest spark in the dark. I ran toward it, my legs burning, my breath ragged. But the closer I got, the colder it became. The temperature dropped, and the light faded as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the shadows. There was no escape. I looked back. It was there. The creature, its body covered in the same jagged, ice-like skin as the tracks in the snow. Its eyes were empty voids, black and unfeeling, fixed on me with a predatory gaze. It moved toward me with an unnatural grace, dragging its limbs across the ground, leaving behind deep gouges in the stone. I could barely move. My legs felt like they were frozen to the spot, and my mind screamed at me to run, but my body didn't respond. This was it. The end. And in the darkness, I could hear the whisper again, soft and raspy. "They've found you." Before I could react, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been seconds, or maybe hours. Time lost its meaning the moment I fell into the abyss. When I opened my eyes again, it was as if the world had changed entirely. I wasn't in the tunnel anymore. The stone walls had given way to something else, something colder, something unnatural. I was lying on a surface so smooth it seemed to pulse with energy. The air was thick, the silence overwhelming. No growls. No scratching. Only the deep hum of something ancient, something alive. I pushed myself to my feet, my limbs stiff and sore. My head spun, but I forced myself to focus. I needed to understand what was happening, why I was here, why this place felt so wrong. But there was no time for questions. I was not alone. The creature from before was in front of me, closer than I had ever imagined. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring my fear. Its eyes, those black, empty eyes, were fixed on me, and I could hear the faintest echo of a voice in my head. It wasn't speaking aloud. It was in my mind. "You should not have come here," the voice whispered. The words felt like they were clawing their way out of the darkness, squeezing into the very marrow of my bones. I tried to back away, but my legs betrayed me. They felt like stone, heavy and unresponsive. The creature's form loomed larger, its jagged, icy skin shimmering with an unnatural glow, like it was pulling the light from the very air around it. "You are the last," the voice hissed, the words twisting with malice. I gasped, feeling a sharp pain in my chest as the realization hit me. The others, the team, my friends, they were gone. They hadn't simply disappeared. They had been taken. And now it was my turn. The ground beneath me began to tremble, and I could feel the cold seeping deeper into my skin. My breath turned to mist as I tried to move, but there was no escape. No door. No path. Just the smooth, reflective surface and the endless, suffocating darkness. I couldn't breathe. The air was thin, as if the very atmosphere was being stolen from me. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum that filled the space. "What do you want from me?" The creature's form shifted, its body elongating unnaturally, stretching and twisting as though it were a shadow in constant flux. I could see now that its face wasn't truly a face. It was a mask, a hollow imitation of something that had never existed. A grotesque parody of a human figure, with features that seemed to shift the more I stared. "You are the last to witness the end," it crooned, its voice rasping like ice scraping against metal. I felt my knees buckle. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. My brain fought to find logic in the madness, to explain this as some kind of nightmare. But the harder I tried to deny it, the more the world around me warped and twisted. The end of what? I gasped, my words broken. The creature paused. For a moment, I thought I saw something like pity in its unblinking eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "The end of your world," it whispered, and in its voice, I heard something I couldn't describe. Something ancient, something that had seen the rise and fall of everything that ever was. It was the sound of inevitability. I tried to push myself up again, desperate to escape, to do anything but face the creature, but my body refused to cooperate. The energy in the air seemed to freeze me in place. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own fear, my own helplessness. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the silence, so loud it rattled my bones. The creature recoiled, its form distorting in agony, as if it had been struck. I didn't know what happened. I didn't care. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, feeling the cold of the surface beneath me. My legs screamed in protest, but I ignored them. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The walls, if they were even walls, seemed to warp and bend as I moved. There was no true direction, no clear path. The landscape felt alive, shifting, pulling at me like it was trying to swallow me whole. The growl came again. The scrape of claws on stone. This time, it was different. This time, I felt it inside my mind. It wasn't chasing me, it was already there, everywhere. And then, as I stumbled forward, I saw it. A door. Or something like a door. A faint light flickered beyond it, the first hint of warmth in this frozen hell. I didn't hesitate. I pushed myself through, my hands scraping against the cold surface, and found myself in a new space. A familiar one. But it was too late. I was back at the beginning. The cave. The snow. The tracks. I stood at the edge of the cliff, staring down at the tracks in the snow. They led off into the distance, like the path had never changed. Like everything I had just experienced was nothing but a dream. Except it wasn't. I turned, hearing the faint echo of footsteps behind me, the sound that had haunted me since the moment I first saw the tracks. I wasn't alone. And I would never be again. Blood on the Old Road. I had heard the stories. Everyone who grew up in Tennessee knew about the old road, the one that led to the forest and had been abandoned long ago. It was a place people stayed away from, a place that was whispered about in the dead of night. They said strange things happened there. People went missing, and others came back, changed. But I didn't believe in ghost stories, at least not until I found myself standing at the edge of that road. It was a cold autumn evening when I made the decision. The sun had set, and the trees around me cast long, eerie shadows across the dirt path. I could feel a chill in the air, the kind that made your skin crawl, but I told myself it was just the fall air. I'd been hiking through these woods for years, but something about this road felt different, as if it were waiting for something, or someone. My name is James Carter. I'm a journalist by trade, always looking for a story, a scoop, something that would set me apart from the rest. When I heard about the strange events happening on this forgotten road, I couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself. As I stepped onto the road, I couldn't help but notice how silent everything was. The birds had stopped singing, and there was no rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the entire forest had gone still, holding its breath. I took a few more steps, my boots crunching on the gravel, and that's when I saw them. The tracks. At first, they seemed harmless, just a few sets of footprints in the dirt. But something about them felt wrong. They weren't like regular human tracks. They were deep, as if something heavy had passed through here. The marks were almost too wide, too uneven. I bent down to examine them closer, my breath fogging up in the cold night air. That's when I heard it. A sound in the distance, something soft, like a whisper, followed by a low thud. My heart skipped a beat. I straightened up, my instincts telling me I wasn't alone. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. No movement. No shadows. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded too loud in the oppressive silence. I took another step forward, my gaze lingering on the tracks. The footprints weren't the only strange thing. The ground around them seemed darker, as though something had soaked into the earth. Something that didn't belong. I shook my head, trying to clear the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. It was just my imagination, I thought. I had to keep moving if I wanted to get to the bottom of this. As I continued down the road, the air grew heavier. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. The faint whispering sound returned, louder this time, almost like voices. Not just one, but many, all murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. It was maddening, the way the voices seemed to grow louder as I walked, only to fall silent when I stopped. Get a grip, I told myself, my heart racing now. But the more I told myself to stay calm, the more the world around me felt wrong. The silence was suffocating. The air was thick with something I couldn't name. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Just the road, the trees, and the growing darkness. The deeper I went, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the whispering voices anymore. I could feel eyes on me, eyes that didn't belong to any living creature. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, listening, waiting. Waiting for me to make a mistake. Waiting for me to go too far. I stopped again, trying to steady my breath. I had to stay calm. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe I was hearing things. The road had been abandoned for decades, and nature had a way of making places feel haunted. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint scream, distant but unmistakable. It echoed through the trees, slicing through the silence like a knife. It was a human scream, raw, desperate, filled with terror. I turned toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have left. I should have turned back right then, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The story. The mystery. The reason I came here in the first place. And so, I walked on. But the further I went, the more the world seemed to distort. The road seemed to stretch on forever, like it was leading me into something beyond the physical world. I could feel the air getting colder, the ground harder beneath my feet. The trees were no longer just trees, they were something darker, something that didn't belong in the natural world. And then, as if in answer to my thoughts, the whispering voices returned, louder, more insistent. I couldn't understand them, but I knew one thing for sure, they were calling me. I turned around to leave, but that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, at the far end of the road. At first, it looked like a shadow, a dark shape in the gloom. But as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a person. But there was something wrong with them. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their eyes were hollow, sunken deep into their face. Their mouth hung open in a silent scream, their body unnaturally twisted. And then it moved. The figure lurched toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of icy fear crash over me. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The road was no longer just a path. It had become a prison, and I was its captive. But as I ran, I could feel the darkness closing in, hear the whispering voices growing louder, and see the figures emerging from the shadows, following me. I had come to uncover the truth about the old road, but now I was just trying to survive it. I ran as fast as I could, but no matter how hard I pushed myself, the road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, as though mocking my every attempt to escape. The whispering voices were all around me now, louder, more insistent, and they weren't just voices anymore. They were feelings, cold, like fingers crawling under my skin, invading my thoughts. The road was no longer the familiar path I had entered. It had become something else, something sinister, something that didn't want me to leave. I glanced over my shoulder, heart pounding in my chest, and saw the figure still following me. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. Each step it took seemed to send tremors through the ground, making the very earth beneath me feel unstable. I could hear its breath, a rasping, wet sound, as though it had no lungs, no life left in it. I ran harder, trying to put more distance between us, but the road didn't seem to end. The trees, which had once seemed so distant, now crowded in closer, their branches stretching out like hands eager to grab me. I could feel their presence, feel their eyes, their waiting. Every step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into their grasp. Then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, I heard something else. A rustling from the trees to my right. My stomach dropped, and I skidded to a halt, my heart hammering in my ears. The woods had gone deathly quiet. Even the wind had stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rustling continued, closer now, but I couldn't see what it was. A low growl broke the silence, deep and guttural. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something worse, something that didn't belong. And then I saw it. Out of the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, low to the ground. A beast, its form barely visible in the dark, moving with unnatural speed through the underbrush. I didn't wait to get a better look. I spun around and ran again, my legs burning, the pounding of my heart filling my chest. The road felt like it was closing in on me, the trees pressing in tighter, the air heavier. I could hear the figure still behind me, but now it was not alone. The forest had come alive, the creatures that hid in the darkness were moving with me, chasing me. I could hear their breathing, feel the earth tremble under their feet. Something was hunting me, something that wasn't human. I was gasping for air now, my breath ragged, my legs weak. My mind was spiraling into panic. How could I outrun something like this? How could I escape something that wasn't just one thing, but everything? The whispers were no longer in my ears. They were inside my mind, turning every thought into a fear, every shadow into a threat. And then, I reached the end. The road ended in a clearing, an open space surrounded by dense trees. The moon hung high above, casting a pale light over the scene, but it wasn't a peaceful moon. It was cold, harsh, like a sickly eye watching me. At the far side of the clearing, I saw it, what I had been running toward all along. A cave, dark and foreboding, its mouth gaping wide like the maw of some ancient beast. The ground around it was stained with something dark, something red. The blood. It was here. Whatever had been waiting, whatever had been following me, it was in that cave. I didn't know what it was, or who it had claimed before me, but I knew one thing, it wanted me next. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I ran toward the cave, the only place that might offer any chance of escape, any chance of survival. The creatures, the figure, it was all closing in behind me. I could hear them now, not just the whispers, but the footsteps, the growls, the thudding of their unnatural movements. As I reached the entrance, something grabbed my ankle, jerking me off my feet. I screamed, clawing at the ground, trying to break free. The pull was too strong, dragging me back. I kicked, I fought, but the grip tightened. A cold, clammy hand pulling me closer to the shadows of the forest, closer to the abyss. I had no choice. I had to go in. With one last desperate push, I pulled myself forward, crawling into the cave's mouth. The darkness swallowed me whole. It was pitch black inside, the air thick with something foul. I could feel the walls of the cave pressing in, and in the distance, I could hear movement. A low hum, like something alive, waiting. I tried to steady my breath, my mind racing. Was this where it would end? Was this what the road had been leading me to? The darkness felt like a living thing, and I wasn't sure if I was running away from the creatures of the forest or towards something worse. The coldness of the cave seeped through my skin, and I could hear something else now, soft, faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps echoing in the darkness, but they weren't mine. They were closer. I wasn't alone in here. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. But then I heard a voice. A low, gravelly voice, whispering from the shadows. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. I looked around, but I couldn't see a thing. My eyes struggled to adjust to the pitch-black darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, overwhelming my thoughts. You shouldn't have come. And then, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The ground trembled harder beneath me, the vibrations running up my spine like a cold, electric shock. I pressed my back to the stone wall of the cave, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the whispering voices, or maybe the voices were growing softer. Retreating into the shadows. I didn't know. All I could hear was the thudding of my pulse, the ragged breaths in my chest, and the feeling that the cave itself was alive, breathing, waiting. The darkness in front of me felt thick, almost tangible. My eyes strained, trying to adjust, but I saw nothing. Just blackness. Nothing at all. But I felt something. It was in the air, heavy, oppressive, as if the very weight of the earth itself was pressing down on me. The voice whispered again, so close now that I felt its breath brush my skin, sending a shiver through my body. You shouldn't have come. It was no longer a warning. It was something else. A truth. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The road. The blood. The things that had been following me. The feeling of being watched, always being watched. It was as though the entire forest, the road, the cave, they were all part of something ancient. Something forgotten. I could still hear it, the faintest hint of movement. Scuttling, creeping, like something was slithering across the stone floor. It wasn't an animal, not a creature of flesh. It was something far worse. Something from the depths. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. I shivered uncontrollably, my breath coming in white puffs, the coldness seeping into my bones. I tried to take a step forward, but my legs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by invisible chains. The deeper into the cave I went, the stronger the pull of the darkness became, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flashlight, my hands shaking so violently that it took several tries before the light flickered to life. The beam cut through the darkness, but the cave seemed to swallow it whole, the edges of the light bending and warping as if the shadows were alive, resisting the intrusion. I could barely see anything, just jagged rocks and crumbling walls, but there, at the far end of the cavern, something caught my eye. A shape. A figure, standing motionless in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man. At least, it looked like a man. But he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. His figure was still, like a statue carved from stone. The shadows seemed to cling to him, wrapping around him like a cloak. His face, if it could even be called a face, was nothing more than a blur of features, an indistinct mass that shifted when I tried to focus on it. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. Suddenly, the floor beneath me cracked. A low, grinding sound reverberated through the cave, and I stumbled, almost losing my balance. The figure in front of me shifted slightly, and I froze, my body rigid with fear. "You shouldn't have come," the voice came again, only now, it was not from the man, it was from everywhere. The cave. The trees. The forest outside. It was as though the very land itself was speaking to me, warning me, condemning me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. The coldness of the cave had seeped into my bones, rooting me to the spot. The figure took a step forward, and I could see it more clearly now. Its body was not human. It was something else. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were too long, too thin, like they didn't belong. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark, hollow pits, deep as the cave itself. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, its voice now louder, more insistent. "You've come for something that's been forgotten, something that should stay forgotten." I felt my breath catch in my throat, and a chill of terror ran down my spine. My mind was racing. What was this place? What had I stumbled into? This wasn't just some old road. This wasn't some forgotten path in the woods. This was something else. I didn't know what it was, but I was beginning to understand that it had never wanted anyone to find it. The figure stepped forward again, its movements jerky, unnatural. It stopped just a few feet in front of me. The air was thick with a feeling I couldn't describe, wrongness, as if every part of the world was twisted, turned inside out. I could feel it now, crawling beneath my skin, scraping at my bones. The road had been leading me here. The voices, the whispers, it was all part of it. It had been waiting for me. "You should leave," it said, its voice now like a rasping breath in the silence. But I couldn't leave. My body refused to move. The path was clear now. It wasn't about survival. It was about acceptance. I had come too far. The shadows grew darker around the figure. It reached out to me, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my arm. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, the world around me went black. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air. My body was drenched in cold sweat, my limbs heavy and unresponsive as if I had been paralyzed for hours. I blinked, disoriented, my vision blurred. The darkness was suffocating, but it felt different now. The cold, the air, it felt deeper, more oppressive. And the silence, there was something wrong with the silence. I couldn't remember how I got here. How had I ended up in this place? Hadn't I just been in the cave? The shadows, the figure, everything seemed like a distant memory, fading like a nightmare I couldn't escape. I forced myself to sit up, my hands trembling as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. I looked around, but there was no sign of the cave. No stone walls, no jagged rocks. Instead, I was lying on a patch of wet, frozen earth, the remnants of the storm that had passed through earlier. The snow crunched under me, cold and unforgiving. I could see the dim outline of trees surrounding me, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like dark fingers. It wasn't the cave, but it felt just as wrong. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky beneath me, and took a few hesitant steps forward. The snow beneath my boots was untouched, pristine, no tracks, no sign that anyone had passed through here. It was as if I was the first to set foot in this place, and that thought only made my unease grow. Then I saw it. A figure. Just ahead, standing motionless in the snow. It was a man, tall, thin, draped in a dark coat that flapped loosely in the wind. The figure was facing away from me, his body almost swallowed by the vast emptiness around us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be. It was him, the figure from the cave. But how? "Do you hear them?" the man asked, his voice echoing through the stillness. It was the same voice. The same rasping, otherworldly tone that had whispered to me in the darkness. I couldn't respond. My throat was dry, my mind reeling. The man turned slowly, his head tilting at an unnatural angle as his eyes locked onto mine. They were dark, empty pits. No soul. Just endless blackness. "You shouldn't have come back," he said again, his voice low, deliberate. "This place is not meant for you. It's not meant for anyone." I wanted to run. My instinct screamed at me to flee, to leave this place and never look back. But my legs were frozen, my body paralyzed by some invisible force. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "What is this place?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his form barely distinguishable against the bleakness of the forest. For a moment, I thought I heard something faint, like a distant murmur, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was as if the land was alive, responding to the man's words. "This place," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper, "has been waiting for someone to come, someone to remember. The road, the blood, the past. It's all connected. It all comes back here. And now you're part of it." I couldn't make sense of his words. The road? The blood? What did he mean? My mind reeled with confusion, but deep down, I felt the weight of his words. The land had been waiting. The forest. The cave. The road. It had all been leading me here. The man's lips curled into a smile, though it wasn't a smile at all. It was something worse, something twisted. His eyes glinted in the darkness, gleaming like two shards of broken glass. "You should have stayed away," he said softly. "You never should have come back. The road isn't done with you. You can't escape it." I took a step back, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The world around me seemed to tilt, the trees bending, the sky darkening. The ground shifted beneath me, as if the earth itself was pulling me in. I was trapped. The figure's smile widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving behind him, something in the shadows, something alive. A sound cut through the silence, a sharp, guttural growl. I turned my head in panic, searching for the source, but I couldn't see anything. The noise grew louder, more insistent, until it was deafening, vibrating in my skull. And then, from the shadows, they came. Figures. Dozens of them. They emerged from the trees, their bodies twisted and deformed, their faces nothing but shadows. They moved toward me with unnatural speed, their limbs jerking, their eyes glowing like embers. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs finally gave way beneath me, and I fell to the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. The figures were closing in, and the man, the thing, was still there, watching me with those empty, soulless eyes. The growls grew louder, and then everything went black. I woke up to the sensation of cold air rushing into my lungs, sharp and biting, as if I had just been pulled from deep underwater. My chest heaved in panic, but there was no panic in my mind. Only numbness. I wasn't sure if I had been unconscious for seconds or hours. The world around me was eerily quiet, too still. The trees, once looming in the distance, now stood like silent sentinels around me. I was on the ground, my face pressed into the snow. I felt a sharp sting as I tried to push myself up. My hands were scraped, my fingers trembling. I could feel the snow beneath me melting into a wet patch on my clothes. For a moment, I thought I had woken from a nightmare. The figures, the man in the dark coat, the growls, maybe it had all been a hallucination. But as I pushed myself up and looked around, I realized it wasn't over. It wasn't even close to being over. The road was before me. The old, forsaken road. The one that had been abandoned for years, forgotten by everyone who once lived near it. The one that had lured me here in the first place. I hadn't even realized it until now, but this road, with its cracked, fading asphalt, was the very one that led to the woods I'd been warned about as a child. It was the one that had always seemed to disappear in the fog. I stumbled forward, my breath heavy, the taste of iron in my mouth. Each step felt like I was walking through molasses, slower, heavier, as if something was holding me back. And then, I saw it. The blood. Dark, glistening, and thick, it was spread across the road in splotches. It snaked across the asphalt like some kind of grotesque art, leading me forward. It had a strange gleam to it, like it had been there for years, maybe longer. It should have been frozen, but it glistened as if it was fresh. New. No. No, no, no. I turned, searching for a way out, but all I could see were the endless trees, the shadows, the looming presence of the road. It felt like I was caught in a loop. This place, this road, it kept pulling me back. The world around me was closing in, getting tighter. The man's words echoed in my head. The road isn't done with you. You can't escape it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. I heard something behind me, slow steps, dragging, like something heavy scraping against the ground. My body froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was too late. They were here. I turned quickly, but the figure was not the man in the dark coat. No, it was something worse. Something older, something that shouldn't have been alive. A twisted, hunched shape loomed in the fog behind me. Its face was covered in thick, dark hair, matted with blood. The shape of its body was distorted, its limbs unnaturally long and crooked. And its eyes, those eyes, they were wide and glowing, staring at me with an unholy hunger. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing jagged teeth, yellowed and broken. It took a step forward. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't obey. The sound of the creature's approach grew louder. Every step felt like a beat of a drum, steady, inevitable. Then the voices started. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind, but soon louder, clearer. The voices of the lost, the ones who had walked this road before me. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come. It's too late now. The whispers churned in my mind, each word more suffocating than the last. My hands shook violently, my vision blurred. There was nowhere to go. The road was a trap. The forest was a prison. The past, the blood, it was all coming for me. I took a step back, my foot slipping on the slick, frozen surface of the road. I stumbled, but before I could catch myself, the figure lunged forward. Its cold, clammy fingers wrapped around my wrist with a strength I couldn't fight. I gasped, trying to pull away, but it was useless. The thing's grip was like iron, pulling me in. As it dragged me forward, I looked around desperately, my heart pounding in my ears. The blood-soaked road stretched on forever, and at the end of it, the end of the road, I could see them. Dozens, hundreds of figures, standing in the shadows, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They were waiting for me. They had always been waiting. In one last, futile effort, I closed my eyes, trying to escape. But the darkness enveloped me, swallowing me whole, as the whispers grew louder. There was no escape from this place. No escape from the past. No escape from the road. The road had claimed its last soul, and it would wait for the next. The underground city. It started with a rumor, like most things that end in disaster. I had heard whispers of strange findings beneath the earth in New Mexico, a place full of buried secrets. Old miners talked about a hidden city, but I thought it was nothing more than legend. That was until I stood at the edge of an opening in the ground, wide enough to fit a truck. We were a small group of archaeologists, myself, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, an expert in ancient civilizations, Dr. Mark Lawson, a quiet, meticulous man who was known for his work on rare artifacts, and Sarah Montgomery, our field assistant. We had been digging in the remote desert for weeks, following leads left by old maps and cryptic reports. The dry wind and the endless sand seemed to stretch on forever, but there was a feeling, an unsettling sense, that something was hidden beneath our feet. That day, Mark had found it. The opening was at the base of a canyon, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. The walls of the canyon were jagged, and the ground below was cracked, as though the earth itself had split open. We stood there, staring down into the abyss. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt an unease settle in the pit of my stomach. The air felt heavier here, thicker, almost suffocating. Are we really going down there? Sarah asked, her voice small, unsure. Mark nodded, adjusting his glasses, his eyes gleaming with excitement. This is it. The city. It's been hidden for centuries, and now we've found it. I wasn't sure if I believed him. The world has a way of playing tricks on those who seek answers too eagerly, and a part of me wondered if this was one of those moments where we'd be chasing shadows. But then, another part of me, a darker part, felt the weight of something ancient calling from the depths. We lowered ourselves into the opening, using ropes to rappel down into the earth. The air grew colder as we descended, and I felt an eerie stillness, as though time itself had stopped moving. The light from our headlamps barely pierced the darkness below. When we finally reached the ground, I could see it clearly, a vast underground cavern, its ceiling high above, dotted with strange formations. But the most striking thing was what lay before us. Stairs. Ancient, crumbling stairs, leading into the darkness, like a passageway into another world. The walls of the cavern were adorned with carvings, symbols I'd never seen before, alien in their design, yet strangely familiar. It was as if the place had been untouched for millennia. "Are we sure about this?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. "Too late to turn back now," Mark said with a grim smile, stepping forward. "This is what we've been waiting for." We made our way down the stairs, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. With each step, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around us. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and the sight that met us left me breathless. The underground city stretched out before us, an entire lost civilization preserved beneath the earth. Massive stone buildings, partially crumbled, stood in a formation that suggested a once great city. But what struck me the most was the overwhelming sense of age. This place had been forgotten, abandoned, for reasons I couldn't yet understand. As we stepped forward into the city, the strange carvings on the walls seemed to pulse, the symbols shifting in the faint light. My heart raced as I noticed something else, a figure. It was faint, but it was there, etched into the stone like a shadow in the periphery of my vision. I froze, staring at it. It was a face, its features twisted and grotesque, as if contorted in pain. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't answer immediately. He was too busy scanning the area with his flashlight, focusing on the intricate designs that covered the walls. "See what?" "There's nothing." But when he looked up, he saw it too. The face. It seemed to loom, watching us, its eyes empty, but alive in some way. "This is strange," he muttered. "The artwork doesn't make sense. It's not from any known culture." Sarah was trembling behind us. "We should leave," she said, her voice breaking. "This place, it's wrong." But Mark wasn't listening. He stepped forward, ignoring the unease that was thick in the air. "There's something here. Something we need to find." It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing, a trail of something dark and sticky leading from one of the buildings. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as we moved closer, it became clear. The floor was stained with blood. I could feel the temperature drop again, this time in a way that chilled me to the bone. My breath came out in visible clouds as I turned to look at Mark, who was already heading toward the building. "Mark, wait," I said, but it was too late. He had already stepped inside. I wanted to stop him, to tell him that this wasn't just a city, it was a tomb. But the words stuck in my throat. And that was when we heard it. A low, guttural sound, like something stirring in the depths. A growl. It wasn't from any animal I'd ever heard. The sound was ancient. And hungry. "Get out. Now!" I screamed, but it was too late. The darkness of the underground city had already begun to claim us. The growl echoed through the cavern like a pulse, vibrating in the very walls. My heart slammed in my chest, my instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs were frozen. Mark hadn't even heard me scream. He was still walking deeper into the dark building, his flashlight flickering as he disappeared into the shadows. "Mark!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. But it was no use. The silence swallowed my words, thick and oppressive. I turned to Sarah, her wide eyes locked on the bloodstained trail. Her hand was pressed to her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs that were bubbling up from somewhere deep within her. The chill in the air had thickened, turning to something far more menacing. It wasn't just the cold anymore, it was a presence. Something older than time, something that knew we were here, and it wasn't happy about it. "Evelyn, we need to leave." "Now," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "This place, it's cursed." I couldn't bring myself to agree with her. I was terrified, yes, but there was something else, something tugging at me, urging me to understand what was going on here. This place wasn't just forgotten, it was alive in some way, waiting for us. I shook my head. "We can't leave. Not yet. We need to know what happened here." But even as I said it, the doubts crept in. The blood, the strange carvings, the growl that had resonated deep in my bones. What had Mark gotten himself into? What had we all gotten ourselves into? "I'll go after him," I said, more to myself than to Sarah. "Stay here. Keep your light on the path." She nodded, though fear was still etched on her face. "Be careful." I took a deep breath and stepped toward the building Mark had entered. The air seemed to thicken the further I walked. Each step felt like it was sinking deeper into the ground, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. The walls, covered in strange symbols and dark stains, seemed to close in around me. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the stone walls, making the place feel alive in the worst way. The blood trail led me to the doorway of what appeared to be a large chamber. The door was barely standing, its wooden frame crumbling, like it had been abandoned for centuries. I pushed it open, my heart racing. Inside, the air was musty and stale, the scent of decay clinging to everything. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing broken statues and fragments of what once were elegant murals, now faded, cracked, and partially obliterated. But the most unsettling thing was the floor. The blood trail didn't end here, it was smeared across the ground, pooling around a central figure. Mark was standing at the center of the room, frozen, staring down at the floor. His body was rigid, his eyes wide, but it wasn't a look of fascination. It was terror. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He was trembling, his hands raised slightly as if warding something off. "Mark!" I shouted, rushing forward. My feet slapped against the stone, sending echoes down the corridor. He didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the ground, his entire body shaking with an intensity I'd never seen in him before. I reached out, grabbing his shoulder and spinning him toward me. "Mark, what's wrong? What's happening?" His eyes locked onto mine, wild and unblinking, and for a moment, I saw something flicker behind them, something dark and ancient. A deep, crawling horror that I couldn't name. It's alive," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The city, it's alive. It's watching us." Before I could ask him what he meant, the ground beneath our feet trembled. A low rumble rolled through the cavern, making the air vibrate with a heavy, oppressive force. The walls groaned, and I could feel the very earth shifting, as if the city itself was awakening. Then came the whisper. Soft at first, like the wind through the cracks of an old house. But as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't the wind, it was something else. Something speaking. The words were unintelligible, the language foreign and twisted, but I could feel the weight of them in my chest, pressing down on my lungs, stealing the breath from my body. Mark's eyes widened in fear. We need to leave. Now. It's calling us. I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. But as we turned, the ground beneath us shifted again, and something deep within the city, beneath the city, moved. The floor cracked open in front of us with a deafening sound, like the ground itself was splitting open to swallow us whole. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest as I tried to hold on to Mark. The walls of the chamber were shifting now, warping and distorting, the ancient symbols glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Get out! Get out! I screamed, but it felt useless. The very air was alive with malevolent energy, and I could feel something closing on us from all sides. But then, just as I thought we were going to be consumed by the earth itself, the chamber went silent. No rumble. No whisper. Only an unnerving stillness. I felt the weight of the air lift slightly, and for a fleeting moment, I thought we might be safe. Mark pulled away from me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. We can't leave, he said, his voice barely a whisper. We can't leave without it. Without it? I didn't understand. What was he talking about? The words escaped my mind in a blur, too terrified to hold on to anything coherent. But as Mark stepped toward the far side of the room, my flashlight caught something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the floor, where the blood pooled, there was an object. A stone, dark and smooth, with symbols carved into it. It was pulsing now, faintly glowing, and I could feel its power, its pull. Mark reached for it. And as his fingers touched the stone, the ground beneath us cracked open again. This time, deeper, wider. And then, the whisper returned. Louder. And this time, I understood. It wasn't the city calling. It was the stone. Mark's hand lingered on the stone. I could see it now, its surface rippling slightly, as though alive, responding to his touch. My chest tightened as the pulsating glow seemed to grow, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. The whispers became clearer, the words now forming in my mind, though they were still incomprehensible, like an ancient language clawing its way back to the surface. Mark, don't, I whispered, though I knew it was too late. My voice trembled as I tried to pull him away, but he didn't budge. His eyes were fixed on the stone, unblinking, and there was a strange, vacant expression on his face. Mark, I shouted, grabbing his arm. But it was like he didn't hear me. His fingers tightened around the stone, and with a sharp crack, the ground beneath us rumbled again. The room seemed to convulse with a dark, primal energy, and the stone in Mark's hand began to glow brighter, casting everything in a sickly green hue. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my throat. The walls of the chamber shifted and groaned, and I could hear the sound of something ancient, stirring from deep within the earth. It was as though the very city itself had awakened, its hunger palpable in the air. Mark, please, I cried, shaking him. We need to get out of here, now. But he didn't respond. His lips moved, but it wasn't his voice that spoke. The words were distorted, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. His body trembled violently as the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. And then, I felt it, a presence. Something was moving in the dark corners of the room, something vast, something that had been waiting for centuries. The walls of the chamber began to distort, their once smooth surfaces now twisted and covered in strange, grotesque markings. The ground beneath us cracked wide open, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting beneath the earth. The whispers, no longer whispers, but a cacophony, filled the room, and I felt my skin crawl as if something was crawling under it, trying to claw its way out. "Evelyn, get away from him." Sarah's voice shattered the chaos, pulling me back to reality. She had somehow made her way into the chamber, her face pale with fear, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "It's too late. We need to leave, now." But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor as if the stone itself had reached out and chained me in place. My eyes were drawn back to Mark, who was still holding the stone, his face a mask of terror and obsession. I tried to scream at him to stop, to let it go, but the words caught in my throat. Something deep within me urged me to keep my distance, to run. But I couldn't leave him behind. He was my friend, my colleague, the person who had led us here. If he was lost, we all were. And then it happened. With a sharp, unearthly crack, the stone in Mark's hand shattered, releasing a surge of dark energy that sent a wave of heat and cold rushing through the room. The ground trembled violently beneath us, and the walls groaned like they were about to collapse. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the chamber, shaking the very foundations of the ancient city. I gasped, stumbling backward. Something was rising from the ground, something massive. The stone floor split apart as a dark figure emerged, an entity ancient and powerful, its form shifting and swirling like smoke and shadows, but with the faintest hint of a human shape. It was enormous, towering over us, its eyes glowing with a cruel, fiery light. I heard Mark scream, but it wasn't his voice anymore. His body was convulsing, his mouth wide open, as if he were being torn apart from the inside. The entity's tendrils of shadow seemed to wrap around him, pulling him toward the dark figure at the center of the room. "Mark!" I screamed, reaching out, but it was too late. The entity's tendrils coiled around him like serpents, pulling him into its dark form. His body twisted unnaturally as if being crushed, and then, with a sickening sound, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "No!" I cried, my mind racing. "We have to get out. Now!" Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit, but the ground was shaking so violently now that it was nearly impossible to keep my footing. The walls were shifting again, the markings on them glowing brighter, like they were coming to life. The whispers were deafening, now a cacophony of voices, all calling our names. We stumbled toward the exit, but as we neared the doorway, the air around us grew heavier. The ground cracked beneath us, sending us tumbling to the floor. I looked back to see the dark figure, now fully formed, towering in the center of the room. Its glowing eyes were fixed on us, and I could feel the weight of its gaze on my skin, burning into me. "Doe! Doe!" Sarah screamed, pulling me up, her face pale with fear. We ran, no, we fled, desperate to escape whatever had been unleashed. The tunnel we had entered through was now a dark, writhing passage, its walls covered in shifting symbols that seemed to come alive as we passed. Every step I took felt like I was running deeper into the heart of the darkness, and I could hear the whispers following us, closing in on us with every breath. But then, as we reached the entrance, something grabbed me, cold, slick, and alive. I turned to see a shadowy tendril reaching out from the depths, wrapping around my ankle. "Evelyn!" Sarah cried, her hand outstretched as she tried to pull me away from the grasping shadows. But it was too late. The darkness had already claimed me. And just before everything went black, I felt myself pulled back into the city, into its cold, suffocating depths. The last thing I heard was the deafening roar of the entity as it called to me. The world went black, and for a moment, I felt weightless, drifting between two realities. There was no sound, no air, no light. Only the deep, all-encompassing void that seemed to swallow me whole. Then, suddenly, I was falling. A sharp, icy wind stung my face as I plunged downward, tumbling through a thick blackness. My chest tightened as panic clawed at me, but no matter how hard I tried to scream, no sound escaped. I had no control, no sense of direction. The fall felt endless, as though I were descending into the very bowels of the earth itself. And then, with a violent jolt, I landed. The impact left me winded, my limbs aching from the force of the fall. Slowly, I opened my eyes, blinking against the oppressive darkness that surrounded me. It was colder here, unnaturally cold. The air smelled of damp stone and ancient decay, a suffocating scent that made it hard to breathe. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling, and began to stumble forward. Every step I took echoed in the silence, reverberating off the walls of what I now realized was a vast, underground chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, ancient and carved deep into the stone. Their meaning was lost to time, but the sense of malevolent power radiating from them was unmistakable. It was as though the very walls were alive, watching me, judging me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and turned to look for an exit, any way out. But as I scanned the room, something caught my eye. At the far end of the chamber, dimly illuminated by a faint, sickly glow, was a figure. It was hard to make out at first. The figure was tall, thin, almost skeletal, standing in the center of a dark pool of water. Its body seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light, as though it were made of smoke or shadow, its form barely solid. But the most unsettling thing was its face, or rather, the absence of one. Its head was a dark void, empty and infinite. I froze, every instinct in my body telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, my body betraying me in the face of this unspeakable terror. The figure began to move, its long limbs stretching and bending unnaturally as it glided across the chamber toward me. It didn't walk, didn't move in any way I understood. It floated toward me, its presence suffocating, its very existence an affront to everything that was natural. A voice, a hollow, echoing voice, broke through the stillness. It was faint at first, a whisper, but it grew louder with every passing second, vibrating through my skull. "You should not have come," it said, its tone a deep, distorted growl, like something speaking from the depths of the earth itself. "You have awakened what should remain asleep." I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my thoughts scrambled. The figure stopped before me, hovering just inches away. I could feel its presence, feel the crushing weight of it pressing in on me. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes and pretend it wasn't real, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't break free from its grip. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the very temperature around me had dropped to a deadly low. I could feel my breath coming out in ragged gasps, clotting in front of my face. The whispers, those maddening, ancient whispers, filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts, swirling around me like an endless storm. "Why?" I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head, too far, almost as though its neck were being stretched beyond its natural limits. Then it spoke again, the words slow and deliberate. The city feeds. And you have fed it. The words were like a punch to the gut. My mind reeled. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. I had never believed in things like this, ancient curses, monsters lurking beneath the earth, but now, in this place, surrounded by an ancient evil, everything I had once known seemed to shatter into pieces. The figure reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushing against my cheek. It felt cold, impossibly cold, like ice, no, like death itself. A vision flashed in my mind, a vision of Mark, his body twisted and contorted, his face frozen in a silent scream. No, I gasped, tears welling up in my eyes. Please, let me go. But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it drew closer, and I felt something shift inside me, a pressure in my chest that nearly took my breath away. Escape, the figure croaked, its voice mocking. You think you can escape? It let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Then, the world around me began to distort. The walls cracked open, revealing a swirling abyss beyond, and the shadows began to twist into grotesque shapes, figures that reached out with clawed hands, mouths open wide in silent screams. The air was thick with the stench of decay and death, and I realized, too late, that this was no mere underground city. It was a tomb, a place that had been forgotten for a reason. And now, it had claimed me. My vision blurred as the dark tendrils reached out, dragging me into the abyss, pulling me deeper into the nightmare that awaited me below. There was no escape. Only darkness. Only the endless whispers. And the city's hunger. The darkness closed in around me, suffocating. I could no longer feel the ground beneath my feet, no longer hear my own frantic breath. It was as if I were being consumed by the very shadows themselves. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed up by the oppressive silence. The whispers grew louder, no longer distant murmurs, but a cacophony of voices, thousands of them, all speaking at once. They pressed against my mind, clawing at my thoughts, twisting them into impossible shapes. Their words were incomprehensible, a blur of languages that felt ancient and forgotten. They seemed to be urging me, pushing me, pulling me deeper into the void. I felt hands, icy and skeletal, grab at my arms and legs. They were everywhere, reaching from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. I could hear them dragging themselves. Closer, the faint scrape of bone against stone. Their grip was suffocating, their touch burning cold. I tried to fight, but my body felt heavy, as though it were made of stone. Panic surged within me, a wave of terror that threatened to drown me whole. I struggled, but the harder I fought, the stronger the grip became. The voices in my head grew louder, more insistent. You should not have come. The words reverberated through my skull, their meaning sinking into the depths of my mind. I remembered then, with horrifying clarity, the journal entries we had found, the warnings about the city's curse. The ancient people who had once lived here had sealed themselves away, hoping to escape its hunger. But now, it seemed, the city had found its way back to life. It was awake again, and it wanted more than just their souls. It wanted mine. No! I gasped, my chest tightening, my vision blurring. I couldn't breathe. The darkness was consuming me, and I couldn't escape. I thought of Mark. Of all of us. The city had already claimed him, twisted his body into something unrecognizable, and I was next. I could feel it now, the weight of its hunger pressing in on me. It would not stop until it had consumed every last trace of us. Suddenly, the pressure released. I fell, not into darkness, but into cold, wet earth. My body slammed into the ground, knocking the wind from my lungs. I gasped for air, but the breath caught in my throat as I realized where I was. I was no longer in the chamber, no longer in the city. I was somewhere else, somewhere darker. The walls around me were damp and slick with moisture, the air thick with the scent of rot. The whispers had stopped, but in their place, a terrible silence settled over me. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning. The world around me seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting in ways that felt unnatural. I could hear something moving in the distance, the faint sound of footsteps. But when I turned my head to look, nothing was there. The terror, though, remained. It was in my bones, in the very air I breathed. I had to move. I had to find a way out. I pushed myself to my feet, unsteady, my legs shaking beneath me. The walls seemed to close in as I staggered forward, searching for any sign of escape. But the deeper I went, the darker it became. The walls narrowed, the space constricted. And then, ahead of me, I saw it. A door. Small, iron-bound, but unmistakable. I stumbled toward it, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. For a moment, I hesitated. The air around it felt charged, as though opening that door would unleash something worse. But I had no choice. I couldn't stay here. With a forceful push, I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing only blackness beyond. But I didn't care. I had to get out. I stepped through and found myself back in the chamber, the one where I had first seen the figure, where I had felt the darkness close in. But now, the figure was gone. The pool of water was empty, the air still and heavy. For a fleeting moment, I thought I might have imagined it all, that it had been some terrible dream. But then, I heard it. The whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. You are not alone. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me began to shift again, cold and oppressive, as though the shadows themselves were closing in. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. And there, standing at the edge of the pool, was Mark. His body was twisted, contorted in ways that defied nature. His eyes, wide and hollow, stared at me with a look that was both pleading and empty. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth hung open as though he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. He reached toward me with a slow, jerky movement, his fingers like claws. And then, without warning, his body lurched forward, dragging itself across the floor toward me. I backed away, fear seizing my every muscle. But I couldn't move fast enough. Mark's form was shifting, changing, becoming something other, something dark and twisted. You have fed it, the voice whispered again, now all around me. Now it takes you. I turned to flee, but the darkness was already closing in. I could hear the whispers, the scraping of bones, the slow, inexorable march of something ancient, something evil. And then, in the distance, I saw them. The shapes, moving toward me, shadows of the long-dead city, brought to life. The city had awakened. And we had become its sacrifice. As I turned to run, the last thing I saw was Mark's twisted face, smiling as the darkness swallowed me whole. And then, there was nothing. The Bloody Eagle. It was an evening like any other in the heart of the American West. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the dry landscape, and the sound of the wind howling through the sagebrush seemed like a distant memory. I had spent the better part of my life on the ranch, and in all my years, nothing had prepared me for what was about to unfold. I'd heard the rumors. Who hadn't? In every saloon, in every small town gathering, the stories were told of strange attacks on farmers, livestock mutilated in ways that made no sense, of people disappearing without a trace. But when you live in the West, you learn to take these things with a grain of salt. Folks are superstitious, after all. And in this part of the world, it doesn't take much to stir up a tale that'll echo through the canyons for generations. But then, it started happening to people I knew. It was late one evening when I first heard the scream. A scream so raw, so filled with terror that it froze me in place. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when the shriek cut through the silence. It was a woman's voice, familiar, but distorted by panic. My neighbor, old Joe Westbrook's wife, Emma. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe it was the wind, the dust in the air, or the thought that maybe it was just some wild animal getting too close to the house. But when I finally sprang to my feet and ran across the field toward the sound, I found the ranch house empty. No sign of Emma, no sign of Joe. Just a few feathers scattered near the barn. I didn't know it at the time, but that scream would mark the beginning of something far darker than I could have ever imagined. Over the following days, I spoke to other ranchers, all of whom had experienced similar events. A few cattle missing. Horses found dead with their throats torn out. Each story, no matter how distant, pointed to the same thing: something was stalking us, something that shouldn't exist. Most of the ranchers were quick to brush it off, calling it the work of wild animals, maybe a pack of coyotes or wolves. But there was something off about the way they spoke. Fear lingered behind their words, in the way they glanced over their shoulders, as if waiting for something to pounce from the shadows. The rumors grew louder. A monstrous eagle, they said. A creature so massive that it could swoop down and carry away full-grown cattle in its claws. Some claimed it had the eyes of a man, eyes that burned with an unnatural rage. And others, those who had seen it firsthand, spoke of a blood-red feathered beast that hunted by the moon. I couldn't dismiss the stories. Not after what I'd seen. Not after finding Emma's blood-soaked body in the field the following morning, her eyes wide in terror, her throat slashed by something that could only have been a talon. The sheriff was no help. Neither were the other ranchers. The rumors only grew darker, more twisted. There were whispers of something ancient, a spirit of vengeance born from the earth itself. Some even said the eagle was a god, an avenger sent to punish those who had defiled the land. But I couldn't believe in gods or curses. I was a practical man. But something was happening, and I had to get to the bottom of it. I decided to take matters into my own hands. If this was some kind of creature, I was going to find it and end it. I wasn't going to sit by and wait to be its next victim. Not when my land was at stake. The first few nights, I patrolled the perimeter of my ranch with a rifle in hand. The wind howled, the sky stretched dark and endless above me, and the only sounds I could hear were the eerie cries of coyotes in the distance. But there was no sign of the eagle. No feathers. No blood. Nothing that could explain the horrors I'd heard about. Then, one night, I heard something different. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the coyotes. It was the sound of wings. Soaring wings, slicing through the night air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly turned to face the horizon. There, silhouetted against the blood-red moon, I saw it. a shadow that loomed large and terrifying, its wings stretching across the sky like some mythical predator. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought my heart might stop. The creature was real, and it was coming for me. I didn't have time to think. My fingers gripped the rifle tightly as I moved toward the barn, hoping to find cover. The sound of the wings grew louder, closer, until I could hear the wind whipping around me. I could feel the vibration of the air, like the tremors before a storm. Then, the attack came. A sudden rush of air, faster than I could react. I heard the flapping of wings, felt the sharp, biting force of talons breaking across my back. I barely had time to scream before I was thrown to the ground, the weight of something immense pressing down on me. I rolled over just in time to see the creature's face, a massive eagle, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, fiery intensity. Blood dripped from its beak, and its wings beat the air with terrifying power. And then, in the depths of its eyes, I saw something that froze me completely. It wasn't just hunger. It was rage. And it was coming for me. I could feel the ground beneath me shift as I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body felt frozen, as if the sheer presence of the beast had locked me in place. The eagle, no, it wasn't just an eagle, its wings stretched out like a monstrous dark curtain against the moonlit sky, and its eyes, glowing with an unnatural fire, bored into me. I stumbled backward, eyes never leaving the creature as it circled high above me. Its sharp talons glinted in the dim light, dripping with something darker than the usual animal blood. I could feel my breath coming in ragged gasps, a mixture of fear and disbelief. What was this thing? A beast of legend? A twisted nightmare? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. It was hunting me. I thought of my rifle. In a desperate move, I reached for it, pulling it up in a shaking hand, the metal cold against my fingers. I aimed the barrel upward, but the creature was already diving, faster than anything I'd ever seen in my life. The air whooshed around me, and before I could squeeze the trigger, it was on me. The force of its strike knocked the rifle from my hands, and the ground beneath me shook as I was sent sprawling into the dirt. I couldn't think. My body refused to move, as if the weight of the thing pressing down on me was too much to bear. Its massive wings beat around me, stirring up dust and debris. My face was pressed against the dry earth, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of the terror. Every part of my being screamed at me to get up, to run, but I couldn't move. The creature loomed above me, its beak snapping just inches from my face. A growl, a low rumble deep in its throat, reverberated through the earth, sending a chill down my spine. Its sharp, dark eyes locked with mine, as if the creature was daring me to look away. The pain in my back flared, reminding me that I wasn't out of danger. I needed to act, but I had nothing. My mind raced, scrambling for any way to survive. That's when I heard it, the faintest rustling sound in the distance, barely audible above the screeching of the eagle's wings. A sound that didn't belong. It was another scream echoing through the air. Emma. No. No, that couldn't be possible. I'd found her body in the field, torn apart by this thing. This thing that wore the face of a predator. But that scream, it was real. It was Emma's voice, or at least, it sounded like her. A shriek of pain and terror, far too familiar to ignore. The eagle faltered in its assault, its talons retracting from the earth. It tilted its head, ears twitching. The distraction was just enough. I grabbed the nearest object, a broken branch from a nearby tree, and swung it wildly at the creature's beak. It squawked, recoiling, giving me just enough space to crawl backward to regain my footing. Every step I took was shaky, my body trembling, but I forced myself to stand tall, to move away from its reach. The eagle took to the sky again, its wings beating faster, louder. I didn't have time to think. I had to move. I had to get to Emma. I had to make sense of the scream. I ran, my legs barely carrying me as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. The night was alive with the creature's presence, the air thick with tension. I could feel the weight of its eyes upon me even as I moved further into the darkness. Every sound felt like an omen. Every rustle of the wind, every shifting shadow, seemed like a threat. Was it still following me? Would it strike again? I couldn't afford to stop and check. I reached the edge of the field, where the land dipped into a canyon that cut through the hills. The moonlight illuminated the rugged terrain, casting long shadows across the rocks. The scream had come from here, there was no doubt in my mind now. I had to find out what it was. And I had to survive. As I neared the canyon's edge, I felt my pulse quicken. The air grew colder, and the faint rustle of the wind was now accompanied by a low, menacing croak. The sound of wings again. Too close. I ducked behind a large rock, my breath shallow, trying to steady my nerves. I wasn't sure what I was about to face, but I could feel the inevitable closing in on me. The creature was out there, somewhere in the darkness. Then, I saw it, a shadow, large and moving swiftly across the rock faces. The eagle had returned. But this time, I wasn't sure if it was hunting me or something else. I had to know. I crept forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The rock shifted under my weight, and I winced at the noise. But it didn't seem to matter. The eagle had landed somewhere nearby, its dark silhouette standing like a sentinel against the canyon walls. I stepped closer, trying not to make a sound. The wind howled in my ears, and I could barely make out the figure of the bird. Its massive wings were folded in, but I could see the blood-red feathers gleaming in the moonlight, stained with something much darker. I wasn't alone. The scream. The voice. It wasn't Emma's at all. It was something else. I froze, the realization settling into my bones like ice. This wasn't just a wild animal or a beast of terror. It was something older, something more vengeful. And it had been haunting us for much longer than I ever could have imagined. The creature's eyes flickered in the shadows, and for a moment, I thought it saw me. The blood-red feathers gleamed even in the dim light, like a flag of war, warning of something far darker than just a predator. The air around me grew colder, the very presence of the bird sending waves of dread through my veins. I crouched behind the rocks, trying to steady my breathing, hoping the bird wouldn't sense my movement. But the feeling of being watched, of something larger than life lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, was unbearable. I could almost hear the beat of its wings, despite the stillness. The air seemed thick with tension. Then, as if on cue, the eagle lifted its head, its sharp beak opening in a silent cry that sent a chill through the canyon. My heart pounded against my chest as I realized that the sound wasn't one of a bird's call, it was something more sinister. The ground beneath me trembled, ever so slightly, and the faint rustle of leaves began to stir once again, but this time it wasn't the wind. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was too tall to be human, too broad to be any man I knew. The silhouette moved with a sense of purpose, each step resonating deep within the earth. It was covered in tattered, dark robes that billowed in the wind like some ancient specter, and as it approached, I felt the temperature drop even further. The eagle, no longer just an eagle, but a beast of nightmares, watched the figure with a strange reverence, its wings folding and unfurling as if preparing for a command. The man, or whatever it was holding something in its hands, though I couldn't make out the details from my position. My pulse raced as I desperately searched for any way out. Should I run? Should I confront the creature? But I knew, deep down, there was no escaping the grip of this dark force. It had been waiting, watching us from the very beginning. I was only now realizing how little I understood. The figure stepped closer to the bird, and as it did, the ground beneath me seemed to grow even darker. I felt my skin prickle with fear. The air thickened as if the canyon was closing in around me, the walls growing taller, suffocating me. Then, the voice broke the silence. It was low, almost a whisper carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was speaking to the eagle. "Did you find them?" the voice asked, and it sent a wave of cold straight through my bones. "Have they come for the relics?" The eagle's wings rustled in response, but it was almost as if it were listening. I dared not breathe as I pressed myself further into the rocks, trying to hide in the shadows. The figure turned, its face still shrouded, but I could feel its gaze sweeping across the landscape. It knew something was wrong. It could sense my presence. "Do not hide," the voice continued, sharper now, like a knife cutting through the night. "I know you are there." I stayed frozen, unable to move. My mind raced. What did this mean? Who was this person? Why was the eagle, this thing, so in tune with its will? Then, without warning, the eagle's head snapped around, its gaze locking with mine. The world stopped for a second. Its eyes pierced through the darkness, finding me with a certainty that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt the weight of its presence, the weight of its ancient hatred. It screeched, an otherworldly cry that echoed through the canyon, vibrating through the very bones of the earth. The figure turned sharply, its robe rustling as it approached. I was trapped, exposed. I could hear the eagle's wings now, louder than ever before. It was coming toward me. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. Every instinct screamed at me to fight, to do something, but I was paralyzed by the enormity of it all. I had no weapon, no strength, just the cold terror that gripped my chest. The figure was nearly upon me now, its face still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its presence, dark, ominous, and ancient. It reached toward me with a hand that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, like a shadow-made flesh. "Come with me," it whispered, its voice like velvet, but there was a venom in it. "It is your fate." And then the world around me seemed to collapse into a blur of motion. The eagle let out a final screech as its massive wings pushed me back, knocking me to the ground. The ground itself trembled violently, and I was thrown, disoriented, onto my back. The world spun around me, the eagle's sharp talons grazing my arm as it soared overhead. The last thing I saw before the darkness overtook me was the figure standing above me, its hand hovering inches from my face. The air grew thick, as though time itself had stopped, and a cold, suffocating darkness pressed in from every direction. I awoke to silence. But not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of something watching. Something waiting. The kind of silence that drowns you, that presses against your chest until you can barely breathe. I sat up slowly, rubbing my head, trying to shake the dizziness. My eyes struggled to focus. Where was I? And then I saw it, the eagle. It was perched on a ledge above me, its blood-red feathers gleaming in the faint light. It didn't move, but its gaze never wavered from me. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that I wasn't alone. The figure from before, it was gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. I had been marked. I knew it then. The eagle's eyes were no longer just eyes. They were eyes of hunger. And as the wind whispered through the canyon, I realized with a sinking heart that I was its prey. I tried to push myself to my feet, but the world around me was a blur. My body ached, my head spun, and I struggled to understand where I was, how much time had passed since the eagle's attack. The canyon stretched around me, desolate and silent, as if the land itself had been sucked dry of life. I could still hear the faint rustle of the eagle's feathers, but it was distant now, just a memory lingering at the edges of my consciousness. But the weight of its gaze still pressed upon me, cold and unyielding. I staggered forward, my legs shaky beneath me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I needed to find shelter, somewhere safe, but I didn't know which direction to go. The wind had died, leaving behind an unsettling stillness that only seemed to amplify the dread inside me. The memory of that figure, the shadow that had loomed over me, haunted my thoughts. Its touch had felt so cold, its words so final. "Come with me," it had whispered. "It is your fate." I didn't know what it meant, but I knew now that I had been chosen for something far darker than I could comprehend. And that eagle, with its blood-red wings and unnatural gaze, was part of it. A harbinger, perhaps. A reminder of something old, something ancient, something hungry. I stumbled forward, the air growing heavier with each step, until I found myself at the edge of the canyon. Below me, the land spread out in all directions, arid and lifeless, as if even the earth was cursed. And there it was again. The distant sound of wings. The heavy thrum of the eagle's flight. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sight of the bird, but I could feel its presence, like a dark cloud gathering just beyond my reach. It was out there, somewhere, watching me. And I knew it wasn't just hunting for food. I started walking again, the ground beneath me cracked and uneven, as if the land itself had been scarred by something long ago. Every shadow felt like a threat, every rustling of leaves felt like the brush of feathers. It was impossible to shake the sensation that something was behind me. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of red and orange, I finally found shelter. A small cave tucked into the side of the canyon wall. It wasn't much, but it was something. I crawled inside, pulling my knees to my chest, my back pressed against the cold rock. I tried to steady my breath, to make sense of everything. But the weight of it all crushed me. The eagle. The figure. The curse that I could feel tightening around me like a noose. I was no longer just a witness to something unnatural, I was a part of it. I closed my eyes, hoping for rest, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I found myself trapped in a restless haze, my mind replaying the events over and over. The figure's face. The eagle's talons. The cold whisper in the wind. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the dry earth outside the cave. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Someone, or something, was out there. I crept to the mouth of the cave, my eyes straining in the dark, trying to make out the silhouette against the starlit sky. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could feel the presence. The same cold, suffocating presence I had felt before. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, its shape tall and distorted, as though it were both human and something else. The robes fluttered in the wind, but it wasn't the wind that made them move. It was the figure itself. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, two pinpricks of light that locked onto mine. "Did you think you could hide?" the figure whispered, its voice like the crackle of dry leaves. "The eagle will find you. It always finds you." My blood ran cold. The eagle. The figure took another step forward, and I could hear its footsteps now, clear and precise, each one sending a shiver down my spine. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the cave was a dead end. There was no escape. "You are part of the hunt now," the figure continued, its tone almost mournful. "You cannot escape what's coming. You are marked. The eagle will take you." I backed further into the cave, my hands shaking. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice trembled with fear. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then it took another slow step forward, the ground beneath its feet seeming to crack and crumble with each movement. "You were never meant to know the truth," it said, its voice growing colder with every word. "But now you do. And now you will suffer." I could see it more clearly now, its face obscured by the shadow of its hood, but the faint glow of its eyes burned through the darkness, piercing me like an unseen blade. It was something beyond human. Something ancient and wrong. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. The silence returned, heavier than before. I waited. Listened. My heart thudded in my chest, but there was no more sound. No more footsteps. No more movement. It was gone. But I knew it hadn't left me. It hadn't left the canyon. And it hadn't left the eagle. The hunt was just beginning. I could feel the weight of the silence around me, a pressure that pressed against my skull, as if the very air was alive with the promise of something terrible. The figure had disappeared into the darkness, but its words lingered, echoing through my mind. "The eagle will take you. The hunt has begun." I tried to steady my breath, but the fear was thick in my chest, suffocating. I wasn't alone. The realization struck me with a force that almost took me to my knees. The figure, had come from the sky. And now, the sky was where the eagle roamed, waiting. I couldn't shake the image of its eyes, those glowing pinpricks of light that had fixed on me like a predator marking its prey. It wasn't just hunting me, it was claiming me. I didn't know what the eagle wanted or what the figure had meant by the hunt, but I was certain of one thing: I was being drawn into something far beyond my understanding. Something older, darker, and far more dangerous than anything I had ever imagined. The night stretched on like a waiting predator, and I stayed as still as I could, too terrified to sleep. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of stone, every shifting shadow made my heart race. I couldn't tell if it was the figure, the eagle, or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew that I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I crawled out of the cave as the first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. The air was still, thick with the scent of dust and the promise of death. The land before me was barren, just the dry, cracked earth stretching out in all directions. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of the eagle's shadow. But I knew they were out there. I moved quickly, my footsteps heavy on the ground, the sound of my shoes crunching against the dry earth filling the silence. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. The closer I got to the edge of the canyon, the more desperate I felt, as if something was reaching for me, just out of sight. Then I heard it. At first, it was a distant noise, a fluttering, a beating of wings that seemed to echo through the canyon. But then it grew louder, closer, and I knew, without a doubt, what it was. The eagle. I spun around, my heart racing as I searched the skies. There was nothing, just a blue expanse stretching out above me. But the sound grew louder still, each beat of the wings like a hammer striking against the air. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of movement, a shadow sweeping low across the canyon floor. It was the eagle, its wings spread wide, its massive talons glinting in the early morning light. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, a figure appeared, tall and imposing, its features hidden beneath a cloak of darkness. It moved with purpose, its steps heavy and sure, its eyes fixed on me like a predator stalking its prey. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to escape. The eagle's cry pierced the air, sharp and predatory, and I could feel its gaze on my back, burning into my soul. The wind whipped around me, sending dust and debris into my face, but I kept running, my legs aching, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't outrun it. I knew that now. The figure and the eagle were closing in, their presence suffocating, the world around me narrowing into a tunnel of panic and fear. The figure's voice echoed in my mind, a dark whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "You cannot escape the curse," it murmured. "The eagle has claimed you." I reached the edge of the canyon, where the land dropped away into a sheer cliff, the drop too high to survive. But there was no choice now. I was trapped. There was no way out. I turned to face the figure and the eagle, their forms growing closer, the sky darkening with the weight of their presence. The eagle hovered just above me now, its wings outstretched, its eyes gleaming with that unnatural light. The figure stood beside it, its face still hidden, but its voice was clear. "You were always meant to die here," the figure said softly, as if there was no more need for words. "The eagle takes, and the land remembers." The eagle screeched, a cry so loud it seemed to reverberate through my bones. It was too much, too overwhelming. The fear clawed at my insides, and I knew then that there was no escaping this fate. The figure stepped forward, and the air around us seemed to grow colder. It reached out, its hand stretching toward me, and I could feel something pulling me toward it, toward the edge of the cliff. I wanted to fight, to resist, but the fear held me in place, my body paralyzed, my mind screaming but unable to move. And then, with one final, deafening screech, the eagle dove toward me, its talons outstretched, and everything went black. The sun rose over the canyon, casting a warm glow over the land, but it was empty. No trace of the man who had run, no sign of the eagle that had hunted him. Just the quiet, eternal stillness of the desert, where the echoes of the past and the wings of the eagle would forever remain. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.